Hello, dear listener, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know how your day has been. Whatever time it is where you are in the world, whether you're settling in for the evening or finding a quiet moment during your day, you're exactly where you need to be. We have listeners joining us from every corner of the globe, and it's beautiful to think that we're all connected through these ancient stories that continue to speak to our hearts today. If this story brings you peace and you'd like to hear more like it, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber. Now let us journey back over 3,000 years to a time when the hills of ancient Israel echoed with the cries of an oppressed people, and discover how God chose the most unlikely hero to deliver them. The sun blazed mercilessly over the barren hills of ancient Israel, its heat seeming to mock the suffering people below. For 7 long years, the shadow of oppression had fallen across the promised land, like a plague that would not lift. The Midianites, fierce nomadic warriors from the desert, had swept down upon Israel like locusts, devouring everything in their path. In caves carved into limestone cliffs, families huddled in darkness, their faces gaunt with hunger and hollow with despair. Children, who should have been playing in village squares instead, learned to recognise the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats, the signal to flee deeper into their rocky refuges. The once fertile valleys that had flowed with milk and honey now lay trampled and barren, stripped clean by the endless raids of their oppressors. The Israelites had forgotten what it meant to harvest their own crops. Each year they would plant in hope, tending their fields with trembling hands, always listening for the sound that would send them running. And each year, just as the grain began to ripen, the Midianites would come. They arrived like a sandstorm, their camels innumerable as the sand by the sea, their warriors dark silhouettes against the burning sky. They took everything, left nothing, and vanished back into the wilderness, leaving behind only dust and desperation. In this time of darkness, when hope seemed as distant as the stars, there lived a young man named Gideon. He was not what anyone would call a mighty warrior. His hands, though calloused from labour, had never gripped a sword in battle. His shoulders, though broad from years of farm work, had never carried the weight of armour. His eyes, though keen from watching the horizon for danger, had never gazed unflinchingly into the face of an enemy. On this particular day, Gideon found himself doing what had become all too common among his people. Hiding. He was in his father's wine press, a stone basin carved deep into the earth, meant for treading grapes. But instead of the purple stain of harvest, this hollow held only wheat stalks and the sound of desperate threshing. Gideon worked quickly, quietly, glancing nervously toward the rim of the pit above him. This was no place to thresh grain, but it was hidden from watching eyes, concealed from raiders who might snatch away even this meagre portion of food. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, a descendant of Abraham, to whom God had promised this very land, reduced to working in secret, like a thief in his own inheritance. The wheat he threshed was barely enough to keep his family alive, and even this small amount had to be hidden from those who would steal it away. As Gideon worked, sweat dripping from his brow to mingle with the grain dust, he wondered where the God of his fathers had gone. The elders still told stories around carefully concealed fires, stories of a time when the Lord had parted the sea, when he had brought down the walls of Jericho, when his presence had dwelt among them in power and glory. But those seemed like tales from another world, stories of a God who had perhaps grown tired of his people and turned his face away. The rhythmic sound of the flail striking grain filled the small space, a lonely percussion that seemed to echo the beating of his own discouraged heart. Each strike felt like a prayer he didn't know how to voice, a desperate plea to heaven from a pit in the earth, and then without warning, the monotonous rhythm was broken by a voice. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Gideon's flail froze mid-swing. His heart hammered against his ribs as he spun around, expecting to see a Midianite soldier who had discovered his hiding place. Instead, he saw a figure sitting beneath the oak tree above the winepress, a man whose presence seemed to make the very air shimmer with an otherworldly light. The stranger's words echoed in Gideon's mind. Mighty warrior? Him? The man who threshed wheat in secret, who started at shadows, who had never held anything more dangerous than farming tools? Surely this visitor was either mocking him or mistaken about who he was addressing. Gideon climbed slowly from the winepress, his legs unsteady, not from exertion, but from the strange presence of this visitor. The man beneath the oak appeared ordinary enough, yet something in his bearing, something in the way the light seemed to gather around him, spoke of anything but ordinary humanity. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon said, his voice betraying his confusion and fear. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The words tumbled out of him like water breaking through a dam. 7 years of bottled frustration, 7 years of unanswered prayers, 7 years of watching his people suffer, while heaven remained silent. If this stranger claimed the Lord was with them, then where was the evidence? Where was the God who had once fought for Israel with fire and earthquake, with angel armies and miraculous interventions? The figure beneath the oak tree regarded him with eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding far beyond human measure. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made the ground beneath Gideon's feet feel somehow more solid, as if reality itself paid attention to his words. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Gideon felt his knees nearly buckle. Save Israel? Him? The man who hid in wine presses, who jumped at the sound of the wind through the barley? This had to be some terrible mistake, some cosmic error in judgment. "Pardon me, my lord," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." It was true. His family held no position of honour among the tribe. They owned no great flocks, commanded no respect in the councils of the elders. Gideon himself was the youngest son, the one who tended to mundane tasks while others made important decisions. He was nobody special, nobody who mattered, nobody whom anyone would follow into battle. But the mysterious visitor seemed unmoved by these protests. "I will be with you," he said simply, "and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The promise hung in the air between them, impossible and overwhelming. Gideon's mind reeled as he tried to comprehend what was being asked of him. But if this was truly a messenger from the Lord, if this was indeed the God of his fathers speaking to him, then surely he could ask for some sign, some proof that this wasn't merely the product of too much sun and too little food. "If now I have found favour in your eyes," Gideon said carefully, "give me a sign that it is really you who speaks with me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." The figure nodded gravely. "I will wait until you return." Gideon hurried to his house, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. He prepared what he could offer: a young goat, unleavened bread made from precious flour, broth to complete the meal. It was a significant sacrifice for a family that had so little, but if there was even the slightest chance that the God of Israel was truly speaking to him, no cost was too great. When he returned to the oak tree, the stranger was still there, patient as stone, eternal as the hills. Gideon set the meat on a rock, poured out the broth, and waited to see what would happen. The visitor extended the staff in his hand and touched the meat and bread. Instantly, fire flared up from the rock, consuming the offering completely. In the same moment, the figure vanished from sight, leaving Gideon alone with the blackened stone and the certain terrifying knowledge that he had been speaking with an angel of the Lord. "Alas, sovereign Lord," Gideon cried out, falling to his knees, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But even as fear overwhelmed him, a voice spoke from heaven itself. "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." Gideon built an altar there and called it "The Lord is Peace," but peace was far from what he felt in his heart. That very night, the Lord spoke to him again, commanding him to tear down his father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. It was to be his first act of obedience, his first step toward the impossible task that lay ahead. Under cover of darkness, accompanied by 10 servants, Gideon did as he was commanded. They worked quietly, dismantling the stone altar and chopping down the wooden symbol of false worship. In their place, Gideon built an altar to the Lord and offered a bull as a sacrifice, using the wood from the Asherah pole as fuel for the fire. When morning came, the men of the town discovered what had been done. Their rage was immediate and fierce. They demanded that Joash, Gideon's father, bring out his son to be killed for destroying the altar of Baal, but Joash surprised everyone, including his son, with his response. "Are you going to plead Baal's cause?" he asked the angry crowd. "If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." From that day on, Gideon was called Jerub-Baal, meaning "let Baal contend with him." But even after this first victory, even after seeing fire consume his sacrifice and hearing the voice of the Lord, doubt still gnawed at Gideon's heart like a persistent wound. When the Midianites assembled once again for their annual raid, gathering in the valley like a dark sea of destruction, Gideon knew the time had come. Yet still he hesitated, still he needed more assurance. That night he took a wool fleece and placed it on the threshing floor. "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised," he prayed, "look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." In the morning the fleece was soaked with dew, while the ground around it was completely dry. Gideon wrung out the fleece and filled a bowl with water, but still he doubted. Still, he feared he was deceiving himself. "Do not be angry with me," he prayed again. "Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." And God, patient with his fearful servant, did exactly as Gideon asked. The next morning, the fleece was dry while dew covered all the ground around it. Finally, Gideon could doubt no longer. The signs were clear, the calling was certain. The God of Israel had indeed chosen him, the least and the weakest, to deliver his people from their oppressors. But as Gideon would soon discover, God's ways of winning battles were as unexpected as his choice of champions. Word spread quickly through the hill country of Israel. Gideon, son of Joash, had called for warriors to gather at the spring of Harod. The response was overwhelming. Men came from every tribe, every village, every cave where families had been hiding. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find. Old swords passed down from fathers, farming implements that could serve as spears, slings and stones gathered from riverbeds. 32,000 men answered the call. It was a significant force, larger than any army Israel had mustered in years. As Gideon looked out over the sea of faces, weathered by years of oppression, but now bright with hope, he felt a stirring of confidence. Perhaps this task wouldn't be as impossible as it had seemed. But even as he counted his forces, Gideon knew they were still vastly outnumbered. In the valley below, the Midianites and their allies spread across the landscape like a plague of locusts. Their camels were indeed as numerous as the sand on the seashore. their warriors a dark tide that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Conservative estimates put their numbers at over 100,000 fighting men, but some said there were twice that many. Gideon was contemplating these daunting odds when the Lord spoke to him once again, and the words he heard made his blood run cold. "You have too many men," the Lord said. "I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." Too many men? Gideon stared out at his army, then down at the vast enemy host in the valley. How could 32,000 be too many when facing such overwhelming odds? But the Lord's reasoning became clear. If Israel won this battle with such numbers, they would attribute the victory to their own military might, rather than to God's power. With a heavy heart, Gideon stood before his assembled forces. These men had left their families, their hiding places, their small measures of safety to answer his call. Now he had to tell some of them to go home. "Men of Israel," he called out, his voice carrying across the gathered warriors. "The Lord has spoken to me. Anyone among you who is afraid, anyone who trembles with fear, may return to his home. There is no shame in this. Go in peace." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some men looked relieved, others confused, still others ashamed. But slowly, surely, men began to step forward, to gather their belongings, to turn away from the camp. What started as a trickle became a stream, then a flood. By evening, 22,000 men had departed for their homes, leaving only 10,000 behind. Gideon watched them go with a mixture of understanding and dread. He couldn't blame them for their fear, not after 7 years of running and hiding, but now his army was less than a third of its original size, facing an enemy that seemed to grow larger with every passing hour. Surely now the Lord would be satisfied with the numbers. Surely now they could plan their attack, develop their strategy, prepare for battle. But as the sun set over the camp, painting the sky the colour of blood, the voice of the Lord came to Gideon once more. "There are still too many men," the Lord said. "Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there." Gideon felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Still too many? 10,000 men were still too many to face 100,000? What kind of battle was the Lord planning? The next morning Gideon led his remaining men down to the spring of Harod. The water was clear and cold, bubbling up from underground sources that had never failed, even in the driest years. The men were thirsty from the march and eager to drink. Separate those who lapped the water with their tongues, as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink, the Lord instructed. Gideon watched carefully as his men approached the water. Most of them, weary and relieved to finally rest, knelt down and put their faces directly to the stream, drinking deeply. But a few, perhaps more cautious or alert, cupped water in their hands and lapped it quickly while keeping their eyes up, watching for danger. When the test was complete, Gideon counted with growing amazement and terror. Only 300 men had lapped the water like dogs. 300 out of 10,000. 300 to face the multitudes of Midian. "With the 300 men that lapped I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands," the Lord said. "Let all the others return home." The dismissal of the remaining 9,700 men was even more painful than the first reduction. These were the men who had stayed when others fled, who had shown courage and commitment. Yet now they too had to be sent away, carrying with them the supplies and provisions that would have sustained a larger force. As evening fell over the camp, Gideon found himself staring at his tiny army. 300 men sat around small fires, their faces illuminated by flickering flames. Some sharpened weapons, others mended gear, still others simply stared into the darkness where their enemies waited. They were farmers and shepherds, craftsmen and traders. None of them were professional soldiers. None of them had trained for this kind of warfare. Gideon walked among them, listening to their quiet conversations. Some spoke of their families, wondering if they would ever see their wives and children again. Others talked about the enemy, speculating about Midianite tactics and weapons. A few prayed quietly, their voices barely audible above the crackling of the fires. "Do you think we can win?" one young man asked his companion, his voice carrying the weight of doubt that Gideon felt in his own heart. "With God's help," came the reply, but even that voice held uncertainty. As Gideon continued his circuit of the camp, he felt the familiar weight of fear settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. 300 men. It was impossible. It was madness. It was a recipe for massacre, not victory. But even as doubt assailed him, Gideon remembered the fire that had consumed his sacrifice, the signs with the fleece, the voice that had called him mighty warrior when he was anything but mighty, the God who had chosen him, who had reduced his army to an impossibly small number, was the same God who had parted the Red Sea, who had brought down the walls of Jericho with trumpets and shouts. Still, as he looked out toward the valley, where enemy campfires twinkled like stars fallen to earth, Gideon found himself struggling with the same fears that had driven him to test God with fleeces. The odds were beyond daunting. They were simply impossible. But perhaps, he thought with growing understanding, that was exactly the point. Sleep eluded Gideon that night. He tossed on his simple bedroll, listening to the sounds of his small army around him. Some of the men snored peacefully, displaying a faith or fatalism that he envied. Others, like himself, shifted restlessly, no doubt contemplating the impossibility of what lay ahead. As the night deepened, the Lord spoke to him once more. "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." The Lord knew him well, Gideon realized. He was indeed afraid, terrified beyond measure. The offer to scout the enemy camp was exactly what his anxious heart needed. Taking his servant Purah, a young man who had served his family faithfully for years, Gideon crept away from the Israeli camp under cover of darkness. The descent into the valley was treacherous in the darkness. They picked their way carefully between rocks and thorny bushes, each step taking them closer to the vast enemy encampment. As they drew near, the sheer scale of the Midianite army became even more overwhelming. Their campfires stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction, creating a galaxy of light in the darkness of the valley floor. The smell hit them first, thousands of camels, horses and men, creating a pungent mixture that hung heavy in the still night air. Then came the sounds, snoring, quiet conversations, the shuffling of animals, the occasional clank of weapons or armour. It was like approaching a vast, slumbering beast that could wake at any moment and devour them. Gideon and Purah crept to the edge of the camp, staying low among the rocks and scrub brush that dotted the valley floor. The nearest tents were only a few dozen yards away, their dark silhouettes outlined against the glow of dying fires. Guards moved slowly through the camp, but their attention was focused inward, watching for disturbances among their own people rather than looking outward for threats. As they settled into their hiding place, Gideon heard voices from a nearby tent. Two men were talking in low tones, their conversation carrying clearly in the still night air. "I had the most disturbing dream," one man was saying. "I dreamed that a round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His companion was quiet for a moment before responding, and when he did, his voice was heavy with foreboding. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. Gideon felt as if lightning had struck him. Here in the heart of the enemy camp, these soldiers were talking about him, about his victory, about their own defeat. The dream was clearly a sign from God. A simple barley loaf, representing humble Israel, would overturn the mighty tent of Midian. He grasped Purah's arm, and together they crept back through the darkness, toward their own camp. But now the impossible seemed possible. Now the 300 seemed not like a pitifully small force, but like the perfect instrument of God's power. The enemy was already defeated in their hearts. All that remained was to make that defeat a reality. Back in the camp, Gideon woke his sleeping warriors. "Get up," he whispered urgently. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." The men rose quickly, gathering around their commander in the darkness. Gideon's voice was transformed, no longer tentative and fearful, but filled with supernatural confidence. "Listen carefully," he said. "We will divide into 3 companies of 100 men each. I will give each of you a trumpet and an empty jar with a torch inside it. Watch me and do exactly what I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then you blow your trumpets all around the camp and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" The plan was unlike anything any of them had ever heard of. No swords, no spears, no conventional weapons at all. Just trumpets, empty pottery jars and torches. It seemed almost like madness, but there was something in Gideon's voice, something in his bearing, that convinced them this was indeed the Lord's strategy. The men moved quickly and quietly to gather the supplies they would need. Clay jars were found and emptied. Torches were prepared and placed carefully inside, so that their light was completely hidden. Each man took a trumpet, though few of them had any experience with such instruments. The plan didn't require musical skill, however, only the ability to make noise. As the first company prepared to move out, Gideon looked at his men one final time. These farmers and shepherds, these ordinary men who had answered an extraordinary call, were about to attempt something that would be remembered for generations to come. They were terrified. He could see it in their faces, but they were also determined. They had come too far to turn back now. "Remember," Gideon said quietly, "we are not fighting this battle alone. The Lord goes before us. Trust in him, follow my lead, and we will see the salvation of Israel this very night." The 3 companies spread out in the darkness, moving carefully around the perimeter of the enormous enemy camp. It took time to get into position, with each group having to navigate difficult terrain while carrying their unusual equipment. But finally, just as the middle watch began, just as the guards were changing and the camp was at its most vulnerable, Gideon's company reached their position on one side of the valley. He looked across the vast sea of tents and fires, knowing that his other 2 companies were in position on the other sides. Somewhere out there in the darkness, 200 other men were waiting for his signal, trusting him to lead them in this impossible venture. Gideon raised his trumpet to his lips, lifted his jar with its hidden torch, and prepared to find out whether the God of Israel would indeed fight for his people. The moment had come. 300 men were about to challenge an army of over 100,000, armed with nothing but faith and the most unusual weapons in the history of warfare. The fate of Israel hung in the balance, suspended in the darkness between doubt and faith, between human impossibility and divine power. The signal came like thunder splitting the night sky. Gideon's trumpet blast echoed off the hills surrounding the valley, a piercing note that seemed to come from heaven itself. In the same instant, he smashed his clay jar against a rock, releasing the torch inside to blaze forth like a star suddenly born in the darkness. "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon," he shouted at the top of his lungs. The response was immediate and devastating. All around the perimeter of the vast Midianite camp, 299 other men followed their commander's example. The sound was indescribable. 300 trumpets blowing at once, creating a wall of noise that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. 300 clay jars smashed simultaneously, the sound like thunder crashing over and over again. 300 torches suddenly blazed to life, creating a ring of fire around the sleeping army. And 300 voices roared out the battle cry, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The effect on the Midianite camp was catastrophic. Men who had been sleeping peacefully moments before were jolted awake by the tremendous noise, their minds struggling to comprehend what was happening. In the darkness, disoriented and terrified, they saw only the ring of torches surrounding them, and heard only the overwhelming sound of trumpets and shouting. To their sleep-clouded minds, it seemed as if they were surrounded by a vast army. The torches suggested thousands of soldiers, each one marking a warrior ready to attack. The trumpets spoke of organised military might, of disciplined forces moving in coordinated assault. The unified battle cry indicated an enemy confident of victory, sure of their superior strength. Panic spread through the camp like wildfire. Men stumbled from their tents, grabbing weapons, looking desperately for officers to tell them what to do. But in the chaos and darkness, with the deafening noise continuing all around them, communication was impossible. No one could hear orders over the sound of 300 trumpets. No one could see clearly through the confusion of flickering torches and deep shadows. "We're surrounded," someone screamed. "The whole Israeli army is here," shouted another. "We're all going to die," cried a third. The panic was contagious, spreading from tent to tent, from company to company, until the entire vast army was in the grip of terror. Men began running in all directions, some trying to escape what they perceived as encirclement, others attempting to mount some kind of defence against an enemy they couldn't see or understand. In their confusion and fear, the unthinkable began to happen. Midianite soldiers, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the chaos, began attacking each other. A man running through the darkness looked like an enemy soldier. A voice shouting commands in the confusion sounded like the voice of an Israeli warrior. Every shadow could be hiding an attacker. Swords were drawn not against the 300 Israelites on the perimeter, but against fellow Midianites. Spears were thrust not at the enemy, but at allies who had become indistinguishable from foes in the panic and darkness. The great army that had terrorized Israel for 7 years was turning on itself, destroying itself in its fear and confusion. Gideon and his men maintained their positions around the camp, continuing to blow their trumpets and brandish their torches, watching in amazement as their enemies did the work of destruction for them. It was the most extraordinary battle any of them had ever witnessed, a battle won without striking a single blow, a victory achieved through terror rather than traditional warfare. As the chaos in the camp intensified, the Midianites began a massive retreat. Those who could find their camels or horses fled toward the Jordan River and beyond. Others ran on foot, abandoning their weapons, their supplies, their wounded comrades, in their desperate attempt to escape what they believed was certain annihilation. But Gideon was not content to simply watch his enemies flee. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the eastern hills, he sent messengers throughout the hill country of Israel, calling on his countrymen to join the pursuit. "Come down against the Midianites," the messengers proclaimed, "and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Men who had been hiding in caves for 7 years suddenly found themselves called to active pursuit of their oppressors. They came streaming down from the hills, like water released from a dam, energized by the news that the mighty Midianite army was in full retreat. The men of Ephraim were particularly effective, seizing the fords of the Jordan River and trapping many of the fleeing enemy forces, they captured and killed Oreb and Zeb, two of the Midianite leaders, bringing their heads to Gideon as proof of their victory. Meanwhile, Gideon and his original 300 men continued the pursuit of the main enemy force. They crossed the Jordan River, following the fleeing armies eastward into the desert. Despite their exhaustion, despite having had no sleep and little food, they pressed on relentlessly. The psychological impact of the night's events had completely broken the spirit of the Midianite alliance. Armies that had seemed invincible just hours before were now scattered bands of demoralised fugitives. The camels that had been as numerous as sand by the seashore were now obstacles to rapid flight rather than instruments of swift attack. Gideon's small force continued to grow as more Israelites joined the pursuit. Men from Naphtali, Asher, and all of Manasseh took up arms and chased the fleeing enemy. What had begun as an impossible battle for 300 men had become a nationwide uprising, a complete reversal of 7 years of oppression. The fleeing Midianites tried to regroup at Succoth and Penuel, but the local officials, perhaps fearing retaliation, refused to provide them with food or assistance. Gideon's pursuit was relentless, driving them ever deeper into the wilderness, further from their base of operations, further from any hope of mounting a counterattack. Finally, in the desert east of the Jordan, Gideon caught up with the remnants of the great army. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two kings of Midian, were there with about 15,000 men, all that was left of an army that had once numbered over 100,000. Even this reduced force vastly outnumbered Gideon's 300, but their spirit was completely broken. The final battle was swift and decisive. The Midianite army, already demoralised and exhausted, offered little resistance. Zebah and Zalmunna were captured alive, bringing to an end the 7-year reign of terror that had plagued Israel. As the sun set on that remarkable day, Gideon found himself looking out over a battlefield strewn with the evidence of complete victory. The mighty army that had seemed invincible just 24 hours earlier was destroyed. The kings who had terrorised his people were prisoners. The oppression that had driven Israel into caves and hiding places was broken forever. It had all begun with 300 men, 300 trumpets, 300 torches, and faith in a God who specialises in impossible victories. The journey back to Israel was unlike anything the land had seen in generations. What had begun as a desperate flight by 300 terrified farmers had become a triumphant procession that seemed to grow with every mile. Men emerged from caves and hidden places, women came out of their refuges, children ran alongside the returning heroes. The roads that had been empty for 7 years, too dangerous for normal travel, were now filled with celebration. Gideon rode at the head of the procession, the captured kings Zebah and Zalmunna walking in chains behind him. The sight of these once mighty rulers, who had struck terror into Israelite hearts for so long, now humbled and defeated, was almost too wonderful to believe. People lined the roads just to see them, to confirm with their own eyes that the nightmare was truly over. As they passed through villages and towns that had been ghost settlements just days before, people poured out of their houses with tears of joy streaming down their faces. Children, who had never known anything but hiding and fear, looked with wonder at the defeated enemy kings. Elderly men and women who remembered the time before the oppression began whispered prayers of thanksgiving to the God who had delivered them. The celebration that erupted across Israel was spontaneous and overwhelming. In every settlement, people brought out whatever food they had hidden away and shared it freely. Wine that had been buried for safekeeping was uncorked and passed around. Songs that had been silenced for 7 years rang out again from hilltops and valleys. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the victory was how complete it had been. The Midianite power was not just temporarily broken, but utterly destroyed. Their military organisation was shattered, their leadership eliminated, their will to fight completely crushed. Never again would they be able to mount the kind of massive raids that had devastated Israel year after year. The psychological impact was equally profound. For 7 years, the Israelites had seen themselves as victims, as weak and helpless prey for stronger predators. Now they had witnessed their God fighting for them in the most dramatic way imaginable. The story of the 300 and their trumpets would be told and retold around campfires for generations to come. A permanent reminder that no enemy is too strong when the Lord chooses to fight for his people. When Gideon finally reached his homeland, representatives from all the tribes of Israel came to meet him. They came with a proposal that on the surface seemed like the natural conclusion to his remarkable victory. "Rule over us," they said, their voices filled with genuine admiration and gratitude. "You, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." It was an offer of kingship, of dynastic rule that would establish Gideon's family as the permanent rulers of Israel. After centuries of loose tribal confederation, of judges who arose in times of crisis only to fade from prominence when the emergency passed, the people were ready for something more permanent, more stable, and who better to serve as their king than the man who had delivered them from their greatest enemy? The offer was tempting beyond measure. Gideon had gone from threshing wheat in secret to being offered the crown of all Israel. The boy who had hidden in wine presses was being invited to sit on a throne. The man who had doubted his own worth was being told that he was worthy to found a royal dynasty. But Gideon's response revealed the depth of his spiritual growth during this incredible journey. The fearful farmer who had needed multiple signs and confirmations had become a man who understood something fundamental about the nature of God's kingdom. "I will not rule over you," he declared firmly, "nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." It was a profound statement of faith and wisdom. Gideon recognized that Israel's true king was the Lord himself, and that any human ruler would be merely a steward of God's authority. He had learned through his own experience that victory came not through human strength or wisdom, but through complete dependence on divine power. To accept a crown now would be to claim credit for what God alone had accomplished. The people were disappointed but not surprised. They had seen enough of Gideon's character to understand that he was not motivated by personal ambition. Still, they wanted to honour him in some way, to create some lasting memorial to his remarkable victory. Gideon did make one request of the people, though it would prove to be a fateful one. "I do ask one thing of you," he said. "Each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." The Midianites, like many desert peoples, wore gold earrings, and the spoils of victory included a considerable amount of such jewellery. The Israelites were happy to comply with this modest request. They spread out a garment, and each man threw a gold earring onto it. When all the contributions were gathered, the weight of the gold was 1,700 shekels, an enormous fortune by the standards of the time. In addition to the earrings, there were ornaments, pendants, and purple garments worn by the Midianite kings, as well as chains from their camels' necks. With this gold, Gideon made an ephod, a ceremonial garment similar to what the high priest wore. His intentions may have been pure, perhaps wanting to create a memorial to God's victory or a way for the people to seek divine guidance. But the results were tragic. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshipping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. The very man who had torn down his father's altar to Baal, who had refused the crown because only God should rule Israel, inadvertently created an object that led his people back into idolatry. It was a sobering reminder of how easy it is for even the most faithful to stumble, how quickly victory can turn to spiritual defeat. The golden ephod, created from the spoils of a battle won by faith alone, became a false god that drew the people's hearts away from the true God who had delivered them. Yet despite this failing, the primary result of Gideon's victory endured. The land had peace for 40 years during his lifetime. The Midianites never recovered from their devastating defeat. Other potential enemies, seeing what had happened to the mighty desert confederation, thought twice before threatening Israel. Gideon himself lived quietly on his estate, enjoying the respect of his people, but never again taking up the sword. He married and had many children, 70 sons from his various wives. One son, born to a concubine in Shechem, was named Abimelech, and he would later bring great trouble to Israel in his quest for the power his father had refused. When Gideon died at a good old age, he was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. His death marked the end of an era, the passing of a man who had embodied both the highest faith and the deepest human frailty. As we reach the end of this ancient story, told now across thousands of years and countless retellings, the lessons of Gideon's life continue to resonate with profound relevance. His journey, from fearful farmer to victorious leader, speaks to truths that transcend time and culture, offering wisdom for anyone who has ever felt inadequate for the tasks before them. The first and most striking lesson is how God chooses his instruments. When the angel called Gideon a mighty warrior while he hid in a wine press, it seemed like either a mistake or a cruel joke. Gideon was none of the things we typically associate with great leaders. He wasn't brave, wasn't confident, wasn't from an important family, wasn't trained in warfare or politics. By every human measure, he was spectacularly unqualified for the task ahead. Yet this was precisely why God chose him. The Lord deliberately selects the weak to confound the strong, the foolish to shame the wise, the lowly to humble the proud. Gideon's weakness became the perfect vessel for divine strength because there could be no question about who deserved the credit for the victory. This principle was reinforced by the reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300. With overwhelming numbers, Israel might have attributed their victory to superior military strategy or exceptional courage. With just 300 men, there could be no doubt that the victory belonged to God alone. The method of the victory itself drove this point home with unmistakable clarity. No swords were swung, no arrows were shot, no conventional battle was fought. Instead, the enemy was defeated by trumpets, torches, and shouting. It was a victory that made no sense according to human wisdom, but perfect sense according to divine strategy. Gideon's story also illustrates the patient grace of God toward human weakness. When Gideon asked for signs, when he tested God with fleeces, when he needed encouragement through overhearing the enemy's dream, the Lord did not respond with anger or impatience. Instead, he provided exactly what his frightened servant needed to move forward in faith. This divine patience extends to our failures as well as our fears. Even when Gideon created the golden ephod that led Israel into idolatry, even when his victory was tainted by this spiritual stumble, God's larger purposes were not thwarted. The peace that came to Israel lasted for 40 years, and the story of Gideon's faith continued to inspire future generations. Yet Gideon's failure with the ephod serves as a sobering warning about the subtle nature of spiritual pride. The man who had refused a crown could still fall into the trap of creating an object that drew worship away from God. Victory can be more spiritually dangerous than defeat, success more corrupting than failure. Even those who have experienced God's power in extraordinary ways must remain vigilant against the pride that can grow from their very victories. The story also reveals the importance of recognizing God's sovereignty in our circumstances. When Gideon questioned why God had allowed the Midianite oppression, he was struggling with one of humanity's oldest questions. Why does a good God permit suffering? The answer that emerges from his story is not a theological explanation, but a practical demonstration. God had not abandoned his people. He was preparing to deliver them in a way that would reveal his power and restore their faith. Sometimes what looks like divine absence is actually divine preparation. The 7 years of oppression created the conditions that made Israel ready to trust completely in God rather than in their own strength. Without that desperation, they might never have been willing to follow 300 men with trumpets against an army of over 100,000. Gideon's reluctance to accept the crown offers another crucial lesson about the nature of true leadership. The people wanted to make him king because he had saved them, but Gideon understood that salvation belongs to God alone. Human leaders are at their best when they serve as instruments of divine will rather than as objects of human worship. This principle applies far beyond political leadership. In families, in businesses, in communities, in churches, the most effective leaders are those who understand that their authority is delegated, that their successes come from sources beyond themselves, that their role is to point others toward truth rather than toward their own personalities or achievements. The transformation in Gideon's character throughout the story demonstrates the power of stepping out in faith despite fear. The man who ended the story was dramatically different from the one who began it, not because his circumstances had changed, but because he had learned to trust in something greater than his circumstances. He discovered what countless others have learned, that God's strength is made perfect in human weakness, that his power is most clearly displayed when human power is obviously inadequate, that the greatest victories often come in ways that make no earthly sense. For modern listeners, Gideon's story speaks to anyone who has ever felt overwhelmed by the challenges they face, whether dealing with personal struggles, family crises, professional obstacles, or community problems. The principles that guided Gideon remain relevant. True solutions often come not through human wisdom or strength, but through surrender to divine wisdom and dependence on divine strength. The story encourages us to look beyond the odds, beyond our qualifications, beyond conventional approaches, to find the unexpected ways that God might work. It reminds us that He specializes in impossible situations, that He delights in using unlikely people, that He often works in ways that confound human expectations. At the same time, Gideon's story warns us about the ongoing nature of spiritual vigilance. Victory is not a destination, but a stepping stone. Success is not an end, but a beginning. Even those who have experienced God's power in remarkable ways must continue to guard their hearts against pride, idolatry, and spiritual complacency. The golden ephod that became a snare to Gideon serves as a perpetual reminder that our greatest spiritual dangers often arise not from our failures, but from our successes, not from our weaknesses, but from our strengths, not from what we lack, but from what we have achieved. As we close this ancient tale, we're reminded that Gideon's story is ultimately not about Gideon at all. It's about a God who sees potential where others see only weakness, who creates strength from surrender, who wins victories through the most unlikely means. It's about divine love that persists through human doubt, divine patience that endures human testing, divine power that works through human frailty. The trumpets that shattered the midnight silence in that valley so long ago continue to echo through the centuries, calling each generation to trust in something greater than themselves, to step forward in faith despite their fears, to discover that the God who delivered Israel through 300 men with torches is still in the business of impossible victories. In our own valleys of challenge and oppression, surrounded by enemies that seem too numerous to count, facing odds that appear insurmountable, Gideon's story whispers the same truth that changed a fearful farmer into a mighty warrior. The Lord is with you, and in him even the weakest can become strong. Even the smallest can achieve great things. Even the most unlikely can be used for extraordinary purposes. The battle belongs to the Lord, and in him, victory is always possible. And so we end where we began, with a simple truth that transcends time and circumstance. When God chooses to fight for his people, no enemy can stand, no odds are too great, and no victory is impossible. The story of Gideon continues to unfold in every generation, in every heart that learns to trust, not in human strength, but in divine power, not in earthly wisdom, but in heavenly guidance, not in what we can see, but in what God can do. May this ancient story find new life in modern hearts. May its lessons take root in contemporary soil, and may its timeless truths continue to inspire faith, courage, and hope in all who hear it. For the God who called Gideon from his hiding place continues to call ordinary people to extraordinary purposes, continues to choose the weak to confound the strong, and continues to win impossible victories through the most unlikely means. The story of Gideon is, in the end, the story of all who learn to trust in something greater than themselves. It is the story of divine love that never gives up, divine power that never fails, and divine grace that transforms fearful hiding into mighty victory. This has been the story of Gideon and the battle against Midian, shared with you tonight through sacred slumber. May it bring you peace, may it strengthen your faith, and may it remind you that no challenge is too great when faced with divine help. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the trumpets of victory and the light of hope. Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin our journey together into this timeless story of faith and courage, I want to take a moment to connect with you, wherever you are in the world tonight. How has your day been? Perhaps you're settling in as the evening draws near, or maybe you're starting your morning with this gentle retelling. Whether it's midnight where you are, or the sun is just beginning to rise, know that you're exactly where you need to be. I'm curious about where this story is finding you tonight. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in North America? Perhaps watching the stars appear through your window? Or maybe you're in Europe, beginning a peaceful morning with this tale. Perhaps you're in Asia, Africa, Australia, or anywhere else across our beautiful world. Wherever you are, you're part of our global sacred slumber family, and we're so grateful to have you here. If this is your first time joining us, or if you've been with us before, we invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber, where we bring you gentle Bible stories and peaceful reflections designed to encourage your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in together as we journey to ancient Israel, to a valley where faith would triumph over fear, and where a young shepherd boy would show the world that with God all things are possible. The golden sun rises slowly over the valley of Elah, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. The air is crisp with morning dew, and a gentle breeze carries the scent of wild flowers that dot the hillsides. This valley, nestled between rolling hills covered with olive trees and scattered stones, would soon become the stage for one of history's most remarkable displays of faith. On the eastern ridge, the armies of Israel have made their camp. Hundreds of tents stretch across the hillside, their fabric fluttering softly in the morning breeze. Smoke rises from cooking fires where soldiers prepare their simple breakfast of bread and olives. The men move quietly, their faces etched with concern, their eyes constantly drawn to the valley below and the opposite hill. For across the valley, on the western ridge, stands another camp. The Philistines have pitched their tents there, their bronze weapons glinting in the early light. These are seasoned warriors, confident in their strength, their numbers, and their champion who has struck terror into the hearts of Israel's army for 40 long days. Between these two armies lies the valley itself, a stretch of land that seems to hold its breath in anticipation. The grass grows green here, watered by a small brook that winds its way through the centre of the valley, its waters singing softly over smooth stones. It's a peaceful place, this valley, seemingly too beautiful for the conflict that's about to unfold. But it's here, in this quiet valley, that we find a young man who will change everything. His name is David, and he's not a soldier at all. He's a shepherd from the small town of Bethlehem, the youngest of 8 brothers. While his older brothers serve in King Saul's army, David tends his father's sheep on the hillsides near his home. David has olive skin bronzed by countless hours under the Palestinian sun, and eyes that sparkle with life, an unwavering trust in the God of Israel. His hands, though young, are strong from years of guiding sheep, playing his harp and practicing with his simple shepherd's sling. He's small in stature compared to the warriors in both camps, but there's something different about David, something that sets him apart. It's not his size or his strength, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that the God who created the heavens and earth is also the God who watches over him as he watches over his sheep. As the sun climbs higher, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, a stirring begins in both camps. The day's challenge is about to begin, and David, though he doesn't know it yet, is about to step into a moment that will echo through eternity. For 39 days, the same terrifying scene has played out in the valley of Elah. As the morning sun reaches its full strength, a massive figure emerges from the Philistine camp and strides down the hillside toward the valley floor. This is Goliath of Gath, and he is a sight that would make even the bravest heart tremble. Standing nearly 10 feet tall, Goliath is a giant among men. His frame is muscular and imposing, built like a fortress of flesh and bone. His bronze helmet catches the sunlight, and his scale armour gleams like the surface of a deep, dark sea. Each scale of his armour has been carefully crafted, overlapping like fish scales to create an almost impenetrable defence. The armour alone weighs more than many men could carry, yet Goliath wears it as easily as another man might wear a simple tunic. In his massive hand he carries a spear, whose iron point is as large as a weaver's rod, and whose shaft is thick as a small tree. On his back hangs a bronze sword, and his legs are protected by bronze greaves that shine like mirrors. Walking before him is his armour-bearer, a man who would be considered large in any other company, but appears almost childlike next to his champion. As Goliath reaches the centre of the valley, near the gently flowing brook, he stops and turns to face the Israelite camp on the eastern hill. Then, in a voice that booms across the valley like thunder, he issues his daily challenge. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" His voice echoes off the hillsides, causing birds to take flight from the olive trees. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." He pauses, letting his words sink in, and then continues with a sneer that the Israelite soldiers can hear even from their distant positions. "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." The challenge hangs in the morning air like a dark cloud. On the hillside, King Saul's army shifts nervously. These are not cowards, these soldiers of Israel. They are men who have fought battles and defended their homeland with courage. But Goliath represents something beyond normal warfare. He is not just a man. He seems like a force of nature, an unstoppable mountain of bronze and flesh. Among the Israelites' ranks are 3 brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, sons of Jesse from Bethlehem. They stand with their fellow soldiers, feeling the same chill of fear that grips every man present. They've heard stories of giants in the land, descendants of the Anakim, who struck terror in the hearts of their forefathers. But seeing Goliath is different from hearing stories. His very presence seems to drain the courage from their hearts. King Saul himself, who stands head and shoulders above most men, feels small in comparison to this Philistine champion. The king who once stood fearlessly against Israel's enemies now finds himself at a loss. He has offered great rewards to any man who will face Goliath, riches beyond measure, his own daughter in marriage, and exemption from taxes for the victor's family. But for 39 days, no man has stepped forward. As Goliath's voice fades across the valley, an oppressive silence settles over both camps. The Philistines are confident, almost jovial in their certainty. Their champion is invincible, and they know it. Soon all of Israel will bow before their might. But in the Israelite camp, fear has taken root like a poisonous vine. With each passing day, with each repeated challenge, that fear grows stronger. The soldiers begin to whisper among themselves. Some wonder if they should retreat. Others question whether God has abandoned them. The shadow of one man, one giant, is darkening the faith of an entire nation. Yet God, who sees all things, who knows the end from the beginning, has already prepared an answer to this seemingly impossible challenge. And that answer is not a mighty warrior or a skilled general. It's a young shepherd boy who at this very moment is walking the dusty roads that lead to the valley of Elah, carrying nothing more threatening than food for his brothers and cheese for their commander. As the day progresses and Goliath returns to his camp with another unchallenged victory, the stage is being set for an encounter that will demonstrate once and for all that the battle belongs not to the strong, but to the Lord. The morning sun is climbing higher when David crests the hill overlooking the valley of Elah. He's been walking since before dawn, carrying a heavy pack filled with roasted grain and 10 loaves of fresh bread for his brothers and 10 cuts of cheese for their unit commander. His father Jesse, concerned about his sons serving in King Saul's army, has sent David to check on them and bring them provisions. As David approaches the Israelite camp, he can hear the familiar sounds of an army preparing for battle. The clank of bronze armour, the scraping of swords being sharpened, and the low murmur of soldiers' voices. But there's something else in the air. Something David can sense even before he understands it. There's a tension here, a fear that seems to hang over the camp like morning fog. David makes his way through the camp, asking for directions to find his brothers. The soldiers he passes look weary, their faces drawn with anxiety. Some pace nervously, others sit quietly, staring toward the valley. This is not what David expected to find. Where is the courage of Israel's army? Where is the confidence that should come from serving the God who delivered them from Egypt and gave them this promised land? Finally, David spots his brothers among their unit, and his face brightens with joy. He hurries toward them, his pack bouncing on his shoulders, but as he greets Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, he notices that they too carry the same haunted expression as the other soldiers. "Father sent provisions," David says warmly, beginning to unpack the food. "He's been worried about you and wanted to make sure you have enough to eat." But before his brothers can respond fully to his greeting, a sound begins to build from across the valley. It starts as a low rumble and grows into the unmistakable boom of Goliath's voice. David stops unpacking and turns toward the valley, his eyes widening as he sees the massive figure striding down the hillside. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David asks, his voice filled not with fear, but with indignation. The words come naturally to him, spoken with the simple faith of someone who knows God personally, intimately, like a shepherd knows his flock. The soldiers around David stare at him in amazement. Some even step back, as if his words might bring Goliath's wrath down upon them. But David isn't speaking recklessly. He's speaking from a heart that has experienced God's faithfulness. In the quiet places, in the fields where he tends sheep, under the stars where he plays his harp and sings psalms to the God who made them. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? David continues, his voice carrying a confidence that seems foreign in this camp of frightened warriors. The soldiers explain about King Saul's promised rewards, but David barely seems to hear them. His focus is not on gold or marriage or tax exemption. His concern is for the honour of God and the reputation of God's people. How can this Philistine be allowed to mock the armies of the living God? How can Israel's soldiers allow this blasphemy to continue day after day? Word of David's questions and his bold words quickly spreads through the camp. Some soldiers are amazed by his courage, others think he's simply too young to understand the danger. But when the news reaches Eliab, David's oldest brother, he responds with anger and embarrassment. "Why have you come down here?" Eliab demands, his face flushed with frustration. "And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are, and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." Eliab's harsh words reveal the tension that can exist even in families when faith and fear collide. Perhaps Eliab is embarrassed that his youngest brother shows more courage than he and his fellow soldiers have demonstrated. Perhaps he's genuinely concerned for David's safety. But David responds with gentle humility. "Now what have I done?" David asks calmly. "Can't I even speak?" He doesn't argue with his brother or defend himself harshly. Instead, he simply continues asking his questions, seeking to understand why no one has stepped forward to defend God's honour. Eventually, word of David's bold questions reaches King Saul himself. The king, desperate for any glimmer of hope, sends for this young man who speaks so fearlessly about facing the Philistine giant. When David is brought before him, Saul sees nothing impressive about this youth. David is small, young, with the sun-darkened skin of someone who works outdoors. He carries no sword, no armour, nothing that would mark him as a warrior. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," David says to the king with quiet confidence. "Your servant will go and fight him." King Saul looks at David in disbelief. "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him," he says, his voice heavy with the weight of responsibility and fear. "You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David's response comes from a wellspring of faith that has been tested and proven in the wilderness places where no one was watching. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep," David begins, his voice steady and sure. "When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." David pauses, and in that pause the tent seems to fill with the presence of something greater than human courage. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Here is the key to David's confidence. It's not based on his own strength or skill. It's not rooted in pride or youthful foolishness. David's courage comes from his personal experience of God's faithfulness. In the quiet places when no one was watching except God, David learned to trust. When wild beasts threatened his father's sheep, David didn't run. He stood and fought, not in his own strength, but trusting in the God who had called him to be a shepherd. King Saul, moved by David's faith, and perhaps remembering his own younger days when he trusted God more completely, finally gives his consent. "Go," he says, "and the Lord be with you." Wanting to give David every possible advantage, Saul dresses him in his own tunic and puts a bronze helmet on his head and a coat of armour on his body. He gives David his own sword to carry, but when David tries to walk in all this military gear, he finds he can hardly move. "I cannot go in these," David says to Saul, "because I am not used to them." So he takes off the armour, removes the helmet, and sets aside the sword. He will not try to become something he's not, or fight in a way that's foreign to him. David will face Goliath as himself, a shepherd boy who trusts in the living God. Instead, David picks up his staff, the simple wooden rod that has been his companion through countless days in the fields. He goes to the brook that runs through the valley and carefully selects 5 smooth stones worn perfectly round by the flowing water. He places these in his shepherd's bag and takes his sling in his hand. As David walks toward the valley, he carries with him something more powerful than any bronze armour or iron sword. He carries the confidence that comes from knowing God personally, from experiencing his faithfulness in the quiet places of life. And he carries the understanding that this battle is not really between David and Goliath at all. This is a battle between the God of Israel and the false gods of the Philistines, between truth and blasphemy, between faith and fear. The young shepherd is ready to face the giant, not because he is strong, but because he knows the one who is stronger than any earthly power. The afternoon sun hangs bright and warm over the valley of Elah as 2 figures begin their approach toward each other across the grassy floor of the valley. The contrast between them could not be more dramatic, and yet it's precisely in this contrast that God's glory will be revealed. From the western hill, Goliath begins his descent, his bronze armour catching and reflecting the sunlight like a beacon. Each step he takes shakes the ground slightly, and the sound of his armour clanking echoes across the valley. He moves with the confidence of someone who has never known defeat, never felt the sting of uncertainty. His armour-bearer walks before him, carrying the massive shield that will protect the giant from any arrows that might be fired from the Israelite lines. From the eastern hill, David begins his own journey down into the valley. He walks with a steady, purposeful gait, his simple shepherd's clothing a stark contrast to the military spectacle approaching from the other side. In one hand he carries his staff, worn smooth by years of use. In the other, he holds his sling, a simple leather pouch attached to 2 cords, the kind of weapon that shepherds have used for generations to protect their flocks from predators. Behind David on the hillside, the entire Israelite army watches in stunned silence. Thousands of seasoned warriors stand motionless, their eyes fixed on the small figure walking steadily towards certain death. Some of them pray silently, asking God to protect this brave boy. Others shake their heads in disbelief at what they perceive as pointless sacrifice. King Saul watches from his position among his officers, his heart heavy with the responsibility for sending a youth to face a giant. On the opposite hill, the Philistine army watches with amusement and anticipation. They point at David and laugh among themselves, joking about how quickly their champion will dispatch this boy. Some of them are already making plans for the victory celebration they'll hold after Israel surrenders, as surely they must, after witnessing their champion's inevitable defeat. But as David walks down the hillside, his heart is neither fearful nor boastful. Instead, it's filled with a quiet confidence that comes from knowing he is not walking into this valley alone. The same God who helped him rescue sheep from the mouths of lions and bears is with him now. The same God who has been his shepherd will be his strength. As the 2 figures draw closer together In the centre of the valley, near the gently flowing brook, Goliath gets his first clear look at his opponent. What he sees fills him with contempt and rage. This is not a warrior, this is just a boy, ruddy and handsome, carrying a shepherd's simple tools instead of weapons of war. "Am I a dog," Goliath roars, his voice booming across the valley, "that you come at me with sticks?" His anger at what he perceives as an insult burns hot. He expected Israel to send their greatest warrior, someone worthy of his attention. Instead, they've sent a child. Goliath continues his verbal assault, his voice carrying clearly to both armies. "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." The threat hangs in the air like the cry of a predator, and even some of the Philistine soldiers feel a chill at the cruelty in their champion's voice. But David, standing in the valley, with the afternoon sun behind him, casting his shadow long across the grass, remains unshaken. When he speaks, his voice carries clearly across the valley, and every word is heard by both armies. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin," David calls out, his young voice strong and clear. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The words echo across the valley like a bell ringing, clear and pure and full of power. David continues, and as he speaks, something changes in the atmosphere of the valley. The mocking laughter from the Philistine hill begins to fade. On the Israelite side, soldiers lean forward, straining to hear every word. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." David's words ring with prophetic power and absolute certainty. He's not boasting in his own strength or skill. Instead, he's making a declaration of faith, a public testimony to the power and faithfulness of the God of Israel. This battle, David understands, is not ultimately about military might or human courage. It's about the honour of God and the revelation of his power to both Israel and the surrounding nations. Goliath, enraged by what he sees as blasphemous arrogance from a mere boy, begins moving quickly toward David, his massive frame covering the ground with surprising speed. His armour clanks and his weapons gleam as he bears down on his small opponent like an avalanche of bronze and iron. But David doesn't flee. Instead, he runs toward Goliath, closing the distance between them with swift, determined steps. As he runs, he reaches into his shepherd's bag and takes out one of the smooth stones he selected from the brook. With practiced ease, born of countless hours protecting sheep, he places the stone in his sling. The sling is not a child's toy, though it may appear simple. In the hands of a skilled shepherd, it's a precision weapon capable of tremendous force. David has used his sling to drive off wolves and bears, to guide wandering sheep, and to strike targets with accuracy at considerable distances. Now as he runs toward Goliath, all those years of practice culminate in this single, crucial moment. With fluid motion, perfected through countless repetitions, David begins to swing the sling around his head, building momentum. The leather pouch whispers through the air as it spins, faster and faster. Goliath, seeing David's movement, may have raised his shield or adjusted his position, but his great size, which has always been his advantage, now works against him. He cannot change direction quickly, cannot dodge with the agility of a smaller man. At the perfect moment, when the geometry of angle and distance and momentum align exactly right, David releases one of the cords. The stone flies from the sling like an arrow, swift and straight and true. guided by skill and powered by faith. The stone strikes Goliath in the centre of his forehead, at the one spot where his bronze helmet doesn't protect him, with tremendous force. The sound of impact echoes across the valley like the crack of thunder. For a moment time seems suspended. The giant warrior, seemingly invincible in his bronze armour, stands motionless. Then, like a great tree falling in the forest, Goliath topples forward and crashes to the ground. The earth trembles under the impact of his massive frame. His weapons clatter beside him, his armour scrapes against the stones, and then there is silence. David runs to where Goliath lies and stands over the fallen giant. Finding no sword of his own, David draws Goliath's own massive sword from its sheath, and with effort befitting his size, uses it to cut off the giant's head, fulfilling his prophecy exactly as he had spoken it. Then David lifts Goliath's head high above his own, and his voice rings out across the valley one more time, "The battle is the Lord's." The silence that follows is profound and complete, broken only by the gentle sound of the brook flowing peacefully through the valley, washing the smooth stones that remain in David's shepherd's bag. The sight of their fallen champion creates an immediate and dramatic transformation in both armies. On the Philistine hillside, the confident laughter and casual conversation die away instantly, replaced by stunned silence and then growing panic. These seasoned warriors, who moments before were planning their victory celebration, now stare in disbelief at the impossible scene in the valley below. Their champion, their giant, their seemingly invincible Goliath lies motionless in the grass, his own sword in the hands of the shepherd boy, who stands triumphant beside his massive form. The psychological impact is devastating. If Goliath could fall to this young Israelite, what protection did they have? What power could stand against the God of Israel? On the eastern hillside, the transformation is equally dramatic, but runs in the opposite direction. The Israelite soldiers, who have been paralysed by fear for 40 days, suddenly find their voices in a great roar of triumph that echoes off the surrounding hills. The sound builds and builds, a crescendo of relief and joy and renewed confidence that seems to shake the very foundations of the valley. "The Lord has given us victories," they cry. "God has delivered the Philistines into our hands." Swords are drawn from sheaths, not in fear this time, but in confidence. Spears are raised high, and the entire army begins to surge down the hillside like a mighty river breaking through a dam. King Saul, watching from his position among his officers, feels his own heart lift with amazement and gratitude. The burden of fear that has pressed down on him for weeks suddenly lifts, replaced by the returning memory of what it means to serve the living God. He gives the command that his army is already anticipating. Charge! The Philistine army, seeing the Israelites rushing toward them and having lost their champion and their confidence in a single moment, turns and flees. What had been an organised military force becomes a scattered mob running for their lives across the hills and valleys of the countryside. The rout is complete and devastating. But as the armies chase and flee across the landscape, David remains in the valley beside the brook, holding Goliath's head and looking up toward heaven with a heart full of gratitude. He has not forgotten, even in this moment of triumph, that the victory belongs to the Lord. This was never about David's skill with a sling, though his years of practice were important. This was never about David's courage, though his faith was essential. This was about God's power to save his people and his determination to show both Israel and the nations around them that he alone is God. David understands something that many of the celebrating soldiers rushing past him have not yet grasped. This victory in the valley of Elah is not an end in itself, but a beginning. It's a demonstration of what becomes possible when someone is willing to trust completely in God's power and step forward in faith, even when the circumstances seem impossible. As David picks up his simple staff and adjusts his shepherd's bag, still containing 4 unused stones, he reflects on the events of the day. This morning he was simply bringing food to his brothers. Now he has become the deliverer of Israel, the slayer of giants, the one through whom God chose to demonstrate his power to the nations. But David's heart remains humble. He knows that he was simply the instrument God chose to use. The smooth stones came from God's creation. The skill to use the sling came from God's provision of years in the wilderness. The courage to step forward came from God's faithfulness in past trials. Even the opportunity to be in the valley today came from God's sovereign orchestration of events. As the sun begins to set over the valley of Elah, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, David begins the journey back up the hillside. Behind him, the brook continues to flow peacefully, its waters singing the same gentle song they sang this morning, as if nothing extraordinary had happened here at all. But everything has changed. Israel has been delivered from their enemies. The name of the Lord has been glorified before the nations. Fear has been replaced with faith, and despair has given way to hope. Most importantly, everyone who witnessed this day now knows with certainty that there is a God in Israel, and that the battle belongs to the Lord. The young shepherd boy who walked down into the valley, carrying only his simple faith and his trust in God, walks back up the hillside as a champion. But he carries with him the same faith and the same trust, because he understands that these were the real weapons that won the victory. Size and strength and bronze armour are nothing compared to the power of the living God when it flows through a heart that trusts him completely. As David rejoins the celebrating Israelite army, his brothers look at him with new eyes. Eliab, who scolded him harshly this morning, now embraces him with tears of joy and amazement. The soldiers who barely noticed the young shepherd this morning now gather around him with respect and wonder, eager to hear him tell the story of his victory. But David's first words are not about his own actions or his own courage. Instead, he lifts his eyes toward heaven and says simply, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who has delivered his people this day." The victory belongs to the Lord, and David never forgets it. This understanding, this heart of worship and gratitude, even in the moment of triumph, is what will carry David through all the challenges that lie ahead in his remarkable life. For this is not the end of David's story, but the beginning. This day in the valley of Elah reveals the heart of a shepherd who will one day be king, a man after God's own heart, who will lead Israel with the same faith and trust he showed when facing a giant with nothing but a sling and the name of the Lord. As we reflect on this timeless story of David and Goliath, we discover that it offers us profound truths that speak directly to our own lives and challenges. The Valley of Elah becomes a classroom where God teaches us about faith, courage, preparation, and the source of true victory. Let's explore these lessons together, allowing them to settle into our hearts like seeds planted in good soil. One of the most striking aspects of David's story is how thoroughly unlikely he seems as a champion. When the prophet Samuel came to Jesse's house to anoint the next king of Israel, Jesse didn't even bother to call David in from the fields at first. David was the youngest, the smallest, the one everyone overlooked. Even his own brothers saw him as insignificant, more of an annoyance than a hero. Yet God specifically chose this overlooked shepherd boy to accomplish what none of Israel's mighty warriors dared attempt. This pattern runs throughout Scripture and continues in our world today. God delights in using people the world considers insignificant to accomplish his greatest purposes. He chooses the weak to shame the strong, the foolish to confound the wise, the humble to teach the proud. This truth offers tremendous encouragement to anyone who has ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or insignificant. Perhaps you feel too young, too old, too inexperienced, or too ordinary to make a difference. Perhaps others have dismissed your dreams or minimized your contributions. If so, you're in excellent company. Moses felt too inadequate to speak for God. Gideon felt too weak to lead an army. Esther felt too powerless to influence a king. Mary felt too young to bear the Messiah. But God sees what others miss. He looks at the heart while others focus on outward appearances. He values faithfulness over fame, character over credentials, availability over ability. When you feel small in the eyes of the world, remember that you serve a God who specializes in doing extraordinary things through ordinary people who trust him completely. The key is not to become someone else, but to offer who you already are to God with complete surrender. David didn't try to become a traditional warrior. He remained a shepherd who trusted God. Your background, your personality, your unique experiences and perspective are not accidents. They are part of God's preparation for the work he has planned for you. David's courage in facing Goliath didn't appear suddenly on the day of battle. It was forged over years of faithful service in places where no one was watching except God. While tending his father's sheep in the wilderness, David faced lions and bears that threatened the flock. In those lonely, dangerous moments, with no audience to impress and no recognition to gain, David learned to depend completely on God's strength. These wilderness experiences became David's training ground. Each time he trusted God to help him protect the sheep, his faith grew stronger. Each time he saw God's faithfulness in the small things, his confidence in God's power increased. By the time he faced Goliath, David had a history with God, a track record of divine assistance that gave him unshakable confidence. This principle applies directly to our lives. The character we develop in private, the faithfulness we demonstrate when no one is watching, the trust we build through small challenges prepare us for the larger battles we'll face later. God often prepares us through what seem like insignificant experiences, developing in us the spiritual muscles we'll need for greater tasks. Perhaps you're in a season of quiet preparation right now. Maybe you're in a job that feels unimportant, dealing with challenges that seem mundane, or serving in ways that go unnoticed. Don't despise these experiences. See them as God's training ground, places where you can learn to trust him completely without the pressure of public attention. Every act of faithfulness in small things builds spiritual strength. Every time you choose to trust God rather than worry, you're developing the faith muscles you'll need for larger challenges. Every moment you spend in prayer, study and worship during the ordinary days creates the spiritual foundation that will hold firm when storms come. David's Psalms reflect a man who knew God intimately through countless hours of communion in the wilderness. His worship wasn't reserved for public occasions. It was the natural overflow of a heart that had learned to recognize God's presence in solitary places. This private relationship with God became the source of his public courage. The contrast between David's response to Goliath and that of Israel's army reveals the transformative power of proper perspective. The Israelite soldiers saw Goliath's size and focused on their own inadequacy. They measured themselves against the giant and found themselves wanting. Fear paralyzed them because they were looking at the problem instead of at God. David saw the same giant but responded completely differently. Instead of focusing on Goliath's size, David focused on God's greatness. Instead of measuring himself against the Philistine champion, he remembered God's faithfulness in past challenges. Most importantly, David saw this confrontation not as David versus Goliath, but as the God of Israel versus the false gods of the Philistines. This shift in perspective made all the difference. When we focus on our problems, they appear insurmountable. When we focus on God, our problems find their proper proportion. The same challenge that paralyzes us with fear can become an opportunity to witness God's power when we view it through the lens of faith. Your Goliath may not be a 9-foot giant in bronze armour, but it's probably just as real and just as intimidating. It might be a health diagnosis that fills you with dread, a financial crisis that keeps you awake at night, a broken relationship that seems beyond repair, or a dream that feels impossible to achieve. Whatever giant you're facing, the same God who empowered David is available to you today. The key is learning to see your challenges through God's eyes rather than your own. When you focus on how big your problems are, they grow larger in your mind, and your faith shrinks. But when you focus on how big your God is, your problems find their proper place, and your faith grows stronger. Faith doesn't mean pretending problems don't exist or minimizing real challenges. David didn't pretend Goliath was small. He acknowledged the giant's formidable appearance and weapons. But faith means recognizing that God is greater than any challenge we face, and that His power is available to those who trust Him completely. Perhaps the most important lesson from David's story is his understanding that victory belongs to God alone. David never claimed credit for defeating Goliath. He never boasted about his skill with a sling or his courage in facing the giant. Instead, he consistently pointed to God as the source of his victory. This humility wasn't false modesty, it was accurate theology. David understood that without God's strength, he would have been just another casualty in the valley. With God's power, he became an instrument of divine deliverance. The difference was not in David himself, but in David's relationship with God and his willingness to trust completely in divine strength. This principle protects us from both despair and pride. When we face challenges that seem impossible, we can take courage from knowing that we don't have to rely on our own strength. The same God who empowered David is available to empower us. When we experience victory and success, we can maintain humility by remembering that every good gift comes from above. Recognizing that victory belongs to the Lord also frees us from the crushing pressure of trying to achieve success through our own efforts alone. We can work diligently, prepare thoroughly, and act courageously, but we do so knowing that ultimate success depends on God's blessing and power. This perspective brings both peace in the struggle and gratitude in the victory. As we conclude our time together in the valley of Elah, I want you to imagine yourself standing where David stood. The sun is setting behind you, casting long shadows across the grass. In front of you lies whatever giant has been challenging your faith, threatening your peace, or blocking your path forward. Your Goliath might be fear itself, that persistent anxiety that whispers lies about your future and your security. It might be doubt that questions God's goodness when life becomes difficult. Perhaps it's a pattern of sin that seems too strong to break, a relationship that appears too damaged to heal, or a dream that feels too big to pursue. Maybe your giant is loneliness that echoes in empty rooms and quiet evenings, or it could be anger that burns hot and destroys relationships. Perhaps it's despair that covers your days like a dark cloud, making it hard to see hope or purpose. Whatever giant you're facing, remember David's words. I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. You don't have to face your challenges alone. You don't have to rely solely on your own strength, wisdom, or resources. The same God who empowered a shepherd boy to defeat a giant warrior is present with you today. Like David, you may feel small and inadequate when you look at the size of your challenges. That's normal and even healthy, because it drives you to depend on God rather than yourself. But don't let the size of your problems overshadow the greatness of your God. Don't let the voice of your giant drown out the whisper of divine love that calls you forward in faith. Remember that God has been preparing you for this moment through all the quiet experiences of your life. Every time you've chosen trust over worry, every moment you've experienced God's faithfulness in small things, every prayer you've whispered in the darkness has been building the spiritual strength you need for this challenge. Take up your simple faith like David took up his sling. Select the smooth stones of God's promises that have been worn smooth by the flowing waters of his love. Step forward, not in your own strength, but in the name of the Lord, who loves you completely and fights on your behalf. And remember, the battle belongs to the Lord. Your job is not to guarantee the outcome, but to trust the one who holds the outcome in his hands. Your calling is not to be strong enough to win, but to be faithful enough to step forward when God calls. As you face your giants, may you have David's courage to step forward, his faith to trust completely, and his wisdom to give God all the glory for whatever victories he grants. May you discover, as David did, that with God all things are possible, and that no giant is too large for the power of divine love. Let us pray together. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the story of David and Goliath, which reminds us that you delight in using ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Help us to see our challenges through your eyes rather than our own fears. Give us David's courage to step forward when you call, his faith to trust in your power rather than our own strength, and his humility to give you glory for every victory. We place our giants before you today, Lord, whatever form they may take in our lives. We acknowledge that we cannot defeat them in our own strength, but we trust in your power to deliver us. Use our weaknesses to display your strength, our fears to showcase your faithfulness, and our victories to bring glory to your name. Help us to be faithful in the quiet places of preparation, knowing that you are building in us the character and faith we'll need for the challenges ahead. May we never forget that the battle belongs to you, and may we always be quick to give you praise for your goodness and mercy in our lives. In the name of Jesus, our Good Shepherd and mighty champion, we pray. Amen. Sleep well, dear friends, knowing that the same God who was with David in the valley is with you wherever your journey leads. May his peace guard your hearts and minds, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed faith to face whatever giants await. Until we meet again in another story, may God's love surround you like a shepherd's care, and may his strength be your portion in every season. Thank you for joining us at Sacred Slumber, where every story reminds us that we are deeply loved and never alone. Hello friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. I hope your day has been filled with blessings, no matter what time you're joining us or where you are in this beautiful world. Before we begin tonight's journey into the remarkable story of Gideon, I want to invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber so you never miss these powerful biblical narratives that can transform your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in as we explore one of the most extraordinary accounts of courage, faith, and divine intervention in all of Scripture. The sun hung low over the hills of Israel, casting long shadows across a land that had once flowed with milk and honey. But those days seemed like distant memories now. The once prosperous nation had fallen into chaos, its people scattered and hiding like frightened animals. For 7 long years, the Midianites had swept down upon Israel like locusts, devouring everything in their path. Picture, if you will, the terror that gripped every village and farmstead. Families would wake each morning, not knowing if this would be the day the raiders would come. Fathers would venture out to check their crops, only to find them trampled and stolen. Children would be hushed to silence at the first sound of hoofbeats on the horizon. The very air seemed thick with fear and desperation. The Midianites, along with their allies, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples, had turned the conquest of Israel into an annual ritual. Like a plague of locusts, they would arrive at harvest time, their camels beyond counting, stretching across the landscape as far as the eye could see. They would strip the land bare, taking not only the grain and livestock, but also crushing the spirits of God's chosen people. Farmers had abandoned their fields, choosing instead to hide in mountain caves and underground chambers. The marketplaces that once bustled with commerce now stood empty and silent. What should have been a time of celebration and thanksgiving for the harvest had become a season of dread and starvation. Israel's cities, once proud and strong, had crumbled into mere shadows of their former glory. The walls that should have protected the people lay in ruins, and the gates that once welcomed travellers now hung broken on their hinges. It was as if the very blessing of God had departed from the land, leaving behind only sorrow and defeat. In this atmosphere of despair, mothers would gather their children close and whisper the old stories of how God had delivered their ancestors from Egypt, how he had parted the Red Sea and given them victory over mighty enemies. But those stories seemed like fairy tales now, beautiful but impossible dreams from a time when God still cared about his people. The elders of Israel shook their heads in bewilderment. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob? Where was the mighty deliverer who had once fought for them? Had he forgotten his covenant? Had he abandoned them to their enemies forever? It was into this world of darkness and desperation that our story begins, in the small town of Ophrah, where a young man named Gideon was about to discover that God had not forgotten his people, after all. But Gideon, like so many others, had lost hope. He had watched his family's livelihood disappear year after year, and he had grown tired of empty promises and unanswered prayers. On this particular day, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, both literally and figuratively, Gideon was engaged in the dangerous work of threshing wheat. But he wasn't doing it in the traditional threshing floor, where the grain could be properly separated from the chaff by the wind. Instead, he was hidden away in a wine press, a place where grapes were normally crushed to make wine. It was cramped, inefficient, and poorly ventilated, but it offered something more valuable than convenience. It offered concealment from enemy eyes. As Gideon worked in his makeshift hiding place, sweat dripping from his brow in the confined space, he embodied the broken spirit of his entire nation. Here was a man reduced to secret, fearful labour just to provide basic sustenance for his family. The very act of threshing wheat, once a joyful community celebration, had become a furtive, isolated struggle for survival. Little did Gideon know that this moment of apparent defeat would become the launching pad for one of the most remarkable displays of God's power in human history. The God who seemed absent was actually watching, waiting, and preparing to use this unlikely hero in ways that would astound both friend and foe alike. The rhythm of Gideon's work was steady but tense. Each strike of his flail against the wheat stalks echoed softly in the confined space of the wine press. His eyes darted frequently toward the opening above, watching for any sign of danger. The precious grain he was salvaging represented not just food for today, but hope for tomorrow, assuming the Midianites didn't discover his hiding place. The silence of the afternoon was broken by an unexpected voice. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's heart nearly stopped. He spun around, flail raised defensively, expecting to see a Midianite scout who had somehow discovered his secret location. Instead, he found himself face to face with a figure unlike any he had ever encountered. The stranger sat calmly beneath the great oak tree that overlooked the wine press, his presence somehow both commanding and peaceful. The greeting struck Gideon as almost mockingly ironic. Mighty warrior, him, the man who was reduced to threshing wheat in secret, constantly looking over his shoulder in fear, and the Lord is with you? If that were true, then why was Israel suffering under such devastating oppression? "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, his voice heavy with skepticism and pain. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The words poured out of Gideon like water from a broken dam. Years of frustration, disappointment, and unanswered questions came tumbling forth. He had grown up hearing the magnificent stories of God's mighty deeds, of pillars of fire and cloud, of armies defeated and nations subdued. But where was that God now? Where were those miracles when his people needed them most? The stranger listened patiently to Gideon's outburst, showing no offence at the young man's boldness or apparent lack of faith. There was something in his eyes that spoke of ancient wisdom and unlimited compassion. When Gideon finished speaking, the visitor's response was both simple and earth-shattering. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" The audacity of the command took Gideon's breath away. Save Israel? Him? The implications were staggering. This wasn't a request for him to join an army or support a cause. This was a divine commission to personally lead the deliverance of an entire nation from a seemingly impossible situation. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon stammered, his mind reeling, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Gideon's response revealed the depth of his feelings of inadequacy. In a culture where tribal strength and family position determined social standing and influence, he saw himself as doubly disqualified. His clan held no political power, commanded no great armies, and possessed no significant wealth. Within that already weak clan, he was the youngest, the most inexperienced, the least likely to be chosen for any position of leadership. But the stranger's next words would echo through the ages as one of the most profound promises ever given to a human being. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The promise was comprehensive and absolute. Not some of the Midianites, not most of them, but all of them. The victory would be complete and decisive, but more importantly, it would not depend on Gideon's strength, wisdom, or experience. It would depend entirely on the presence and power of God himself. Still struggling to believe what he was hearing, Gideon made a request that would reveal both his desire for faith and his need for certainty. "If now I have found favour in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." The stranger agreed to wait, and Gideon hurried to his house to prepare an offering. His heart raced as he worked, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared a young goat and made bread from an ephah of flour. This was not a small offering by the standards of his time, especially for a family struggling under the oppression of constant raids. Yet something within him compelled him to give generously, to honour this mysterious visitor properly. When Gideon returned with the prepared food, the stranger instructed him to place the meat and unleavened bread on a rock and pour out the broth. Gideon obeyed, though he couldn't understand the purpose of these strange instructions. What happened next would leave no doubt about the supernatural nature of his visitor. The stranger touched the meat and bread with the tip of the staff he carried, and immediately fire flared from the rock, consuming the entire offering in an instant. The flames burned with an intensity and heat that no ordinary fire could match, leaving nothing behind but the memory of their brilliance. In that same moment, the stranger vanished from sight, disappearing as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared. Terror gripped Gideon's heart as the full realization of what had just occurred crashed over him like a mighty wave. This had been no ordinary man, no mere messenger or prophet. This had been the angel of the Lord, a manifestation of God himself. In that moment of understanding, Gideon was overwhelmed not with joy, but with mortal fear. "Alas, sovereign Lord," he cried out in anguish, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." In the ancient world, it was believed that no human could see God and live. The very encounter that should have filled him with confidence instead filled him with terror. Had his boldness in questioning and testing the Lord sealed his doom? Would he die for having stood in the presence of the Almighty? But even in his moment of greatest fear, God's grace reached out to comfort him. The voice of the Lord came to him again, gentle and reassuring. "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." With his own hands, Gideon built an altar on that spot and called it, "The Lord is Peace." The place where he had threshed wheat in fear and desperation had become holy ground, the site of a divine encounter that would change not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. As night fell over Ophrah, Gideon stood beside his new altar, his mind swirling with the magnitude of what had occurred. The God of his ancestors had not abandoned Israel after all. He had been working, planning, preparing for this very moment, and somehow, incredibly, he had chosen Gideon to be his instrument of deliverance. Yet even as faith began to bloom in his heart, doubt lingered like shadows at the edges of his mind. The task before him seemed impossible, the odds insurmountable. How could he, one man from the weakest clan in Manasseh, possibly hope to defeat the countless multitudes of Midian and their allies? It was a question that would lead him to make one of the most famous requests for divine confirmation in all of Scripture. The days following Gideon's encounter with the angel of the Lord were filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The divine commissioning had been clear and unmistakable, yet the human heart, prone to doubt and fear, struggled to fully embrace what seemed impossible. Gideon found himself caught between the supernatural certainty of his calling and the natural uncertainties of his circumstances. As he went about his daily tasks, Gideon's mind constantly returned to that moment when fire had consumed his offering and the angel had vanished from sight. Had it really happened? In the bright light of day, with the familiar sounds and sights of ordinary life surrounding him, the encounter almost seemed like a dream. Yet the altar he had built stood as a permanent reminder, its stones bearing witness to the reality of what had occurred. Word began to spread quietly through the region about Gideon's calling. Some believed and were filled with hope for the first time in years. Others were skeptical, wondering how this young man could possibly succeed where so many others had failed. Still others were fearful, worried that any attempt at resistance would only bring more severe retaliation from their oppressors. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Gideon's shoulders. He was being asked not just to risk his own life, but potentially to lead others to their deaths. What if he had misunderstood? What if his faith had somehow led him astray? The consequences of a mistake would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for all who would follow him. It was in this state of mind that Gideon made his famous request for divine confirmation. The fleece test, as it would come to be known, represented not a lack of faith, but rather a deep desire for certainty in the face of overwhelming responsibility. "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised," Gideon prayed earnestly, "look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." The request was specific and measurable. In the normal course of nature, dew would form on all surfaces exposed to the night air. If God could reverse this natural process, causing moisture to collect only on the fleece, while leaving the surrounding ground completely dry, it would serve as an unmistakable sign of divine intervention. Gideon placed the fleece carefully on the threshing floor as evening approached. All through the night he must have awakened periodically, wondering what he would find in the morning. As dawn broke, he hurried to the spot where he had placed his test. What he discovered filled him with wonder and awe. The fleece was thoroughly saturated with dew, so much so that when he wrung it out, he was able to fill an entire bowl with water. Yet all around it, the ground was completely dry, as if an invisible barrier had prevented any moisture from settling anywhere but on the wool. The sign was clear and unmistakable, yet Gideon's human nature craved even greater certainty. The magnitude of what he was being called to do seemed to justify asking for additional confirmation. With remarkable humility and boldness, he approached God with yet another request. "Do not be angry with me," Gideon prayed, acknowledging that his repeated testing might seem to indicate a lack of trust. "Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." This second test was even more remarkable than the first. It would be one thing for God to cause dew to collect on a single object, while keeping the surrounding area dry, but it would be quite another to keep one small piece of wool completely dry while saturating everything around it. This second sign would demonstrate not just God's power over nature, but his precise control over the smallest details. Again, Gideon placed the fleece on the threshing floor and waited through the night. When morning came, he found exactly what he had requested. The fleece was bone dry without a trace of moisture, while the ground all around it sparkled with heavy dew. The grass, the stones, the nearby trees, everything was wet with the night's moisture, except for that one small piece of wool. God had patiently granted both requests, demonstrating not anger at Gideon's need for reassurance, but understanding and compassion for human weakness. The fleece tests revealed important truths about the nature of faith and the character of God. Faith is not the absence of questions or doubts. Rather, it is the willingness to act in obedience despite those questions and doubts. Moreover, God's response to Gideon's requests showed his patience with those who seek him earnestly. He did not rebuke Gideon for his need for confirmation, nor did he withdraw his calling because of the young man's hesitation. Instead, he graciously provided the assurance that Gideon needed to step forward in faith. The fleece tests also demonstrated the balance between seeking divine guidance and taking action. There comes a point when further testing can become an excuse for inaction, when the desire for certainty becomes a barrier to obedience. Gideon wisely limited his requests to 2 clear signs, then proceeded to act on what he had received. As news of these miraculous signs spread throughout the tribes of Israel, hope began to stir in hearts that had been dormant for years. Perhaps God had not forgotten them after all. Perhaps deliverance was indeed coming through this unlikely young man from Ophrah. But before Gideon could lead Israel into battle against their oppressors, he would need to assemble an army. The call went out throughout the territories of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Men who had been hiding in caves and mountain strongholds began to emerge, drawn by the promise of freedom and the reports of God's miraculous confirmations. The response was overwhelming. 32,000 men answered the call, a substantial army by any measure. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen, fathers and sons, united by their hatred of oppression and their desperate hope for liberation. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find, swords that had been hidden from enemy raids, spears hastily fashioned from farming tools, bows that had been used for hunting game in the wilderness. As Gideon looked out over this vast assembly of volunteers, he might have felt a surge of confidence. Surely with 32,000 men, even amateur fighters, he could mount a credible challenge to the Midianite forces. The odds were still daunting, given that the enemy could field armies many times larger, but at least now they had a fighting chance. Yet God had other plans. The fleece tests had been preparation not just for Gideon's faith, but for an even greater demonstration of divine power. The true test was not whether Gideon could trust God with impossible signs, but whether he could trust God with an impossible strategy. What happened next would shock both Gideon and his army, challenging every human assumption about warfare and victory. God was about to demonstrate that his ways are not our ways, and that his power is made perfect, not in human strength, but in human weakness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as 32,000 men prepared for what they believed would be their march to war. Weapons were sharpened, provisions were packed, and final prayers were offered. The air buzzed with nervous energy as farmers turned warriors contemplated the battle that lay ahead. Gideon moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement and trying to project the confidence that a leader must display. Yet privately, he was still awed by the magnitude of what was happening. Just weeks earlier, he had been hiding in a wine press, and now he stood at the head of the largest volunteer army Israel had assembled in generations. But as the army prepared to march toward the enemy encampment, God spoke to Gideon with words that must have sent shockwaves through his entire being. "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. Our own strength has saved us." Too many men? The statement seemed to defy all military logic. The Midianites and their allies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their camels alone described as being like locusts for multitude. How could 32,000 possibly be considered too many? Yet God's reasoning revealed a profound truth about the nature of divine deliverance. If Israel won the coming battle through conventional military means, they would inevitably credit their victory to their own strength, strategy, and courage. The victory needed to be so obviously supernatural that no one could mistake its source. God's glory was at stake, and that glory could not be shared with human pride. Following God's instructions, Gideon stood before his assembled army and made an announcement that must have stunned many of the volunteers. Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. The offer was based on an ancient law found in Deuteronomy, which recognized that fearful soldiers could spread panic through the ranks and actually weaken an army's effectiveness. But in this case, the dismissal served a different purpose entirely. God was beginning the process of reducing the army to a size that would make his intervention unmistakable. The response to Gideon's announcement was immediate and devastating. 22,000 men took advantage of the opportunity to withdraw from what many probably saw as a suicide mission anyway. These were not cowards in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people facing an extraordinary situation, and they chose the safety of their families over the uncertainties of battle. As Gideon watched more than 2/3 of his army walk away, his heart must have sunk. 10,000 men remained, still a respectable force, but far fewer than what seemed necessary for the task ahead. Surely now they could proceed with God's blessing. But God was not finished with his reductions. "There are still too many men," came the divine word. "Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." The instruction was puzzling and specific. Gideon was to observe how the men drank water and select his final army based on their drinking method. Of all the criteria that might be used to choose warriors, how they consumed water seemed among the least relevant to military prowess. At the water's edge, the 10,000 men revealed their character through their approach to drinking. The vast majority knelt down and put their faces directly to the water, drinking deeply and focusing entirely on satisfying their thirst. But a small group, only 300 men, demonstrated a different approach. They brought water to their mouths with their hands, lapping it like dogs while maintaining their vigilance and readiness. God's instruction was clear. "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." The reduction was complete and shocking. From 32,000 to 300 represented a decrease of more than 99%. What had begun as a substantial army was now reduced to little more than a large company. The odds, already daunting, had become mathematically absurd. Yet the selection criteria revealed profound spiritual truths. The 300 men who were chosen had demonstrated alertness, self-discipline, and readiness, even in a moment of personal need. While drinking, they had maintained their awareness of their surroundings, prepared for action at a moment's notice. These qualities, while admirable in soldiers, were really symbols of spiritual preparedness and faithfulness. As the dismissed soldiers departed, taking most of the weapons and supplies with them, Gideon was left with 300 men who looked more like a ceremonial guard than a fighting force. The enemy they faced was described in terms that emphasized their overwhelming numbers. All the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. The disparity was so extreme that it moved beyond the realm of military strategy into the realm of the miraculous. No human commander would voluntarily reduce his forces to such a level when facing such overwhelming odds. Yet this was precisely God's point. The victory that was coming would be so clearly divine in origin that no one could attribute it to human planning or prowess. For Gideon, this final reduction must have been the ultimate test of faith. Everything in his military thinking, everything in his natural instincts, everything in conventional wisdom screamed against such a strategy. Yet his experiences with the fleece had prepared him for this moment. He had learned to trust God's ways even when they contradicted human logic. The 300 men who remained showed remarkable faith as well. They could see the enemy forces spread across the valley below them. They knew the odds better than anyone, yet they chose to stay, to trust in the God who had called them through his servant Gideon. As night fell over the Israelite camp, the 300 men prepared for what would be the most unconventional battle in military history. They had no idea that they were about to participate in a victory that would be remembered and celebrated for thousands of years. A victory that would demonstrate God's power to use the weak to confound the mighty. The stage was set for a night that would change everything. The Midianites slept in their countless tents, confident in their overwhelming superiority. The 300 Israelites made their final preparations, trusting in a God who specialized in impossible victories. The hours before dawn are often the darkest, both literally and figuratively. As Gideon and his 300 men crouched in the hills overlooking the vast enemy encampment, the weight of their impossible mission pressed down upon them like a physical burden. The valley below was filled with the tents of their enemies, stretching as far as the eye could see in the starlight, a sea of canvas that housed an army larger than any they had ever faced. Despite the miraculous signs he had witnessed and the divine assurances he had received, Gideon still struggled with doubt. God, in his infinite understanding of human nature, provided one more confirmation before the battle commenced. "Get up, go down against the camp," the Lord instructed, "because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." The offer revealed God's compassionate understanding of Gideon's anxiety. Rather than rebuking him for his continued fears, the Lord provided an opportunity for reassurance. Taking his servant Purah with him, Gideon crept down toward the perimeter of the enemy camp under cover of darkness. The Midianite camp was massive beyond imagination. Thousands upon thousands of tents housed warriors from multiple nations united in their conquest of Israel. The sounds of the sleeping army filled the night air, snoring soldiers, restless camels, the occasional challenge of sentries. The very scale of the enemy forces should have been overwhelming to any reasonable observer. As Gideon and Purah approached the outer edge of the camp, they overheard a conversation between two Midianite soldiers. One was telling his companion about a disturbing dream he had experienced. "I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." The interpretation offered by his fellow soldier was even more remarkable. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." The irony was profound. Here, in the heart of the enemy camp, God was providing confirmation through the mouths of Israel's oppressors themselves. The barley bread in the dream was significant. Barley was considered the food of the poor, inferior to wheat. Yet in the dream, this humble loaf had the power to destroy the entire enemy position. The symbolism was clear. God would use the humble and despised to bring down the mighty and proud. That Gideon's name was already known to the enemy indicated that word of the gathering Israelite resistance had reached their ears. Rather than being encouraged by their overwhelming numerical superiority, some among the Midianites were apparently experiencing anxiety about this upstart Hebrew leader. God was already working in the hearts and minds of the enemy, preparing them for defeat. Gideon and Purah retreated to their own lines, hearts pounding with excitement and renewed confidence. The doubt that had plagued Gideon was finally dispelled by this remarkable confirmation. When they reached the Israelite position, Gideon called his men together for final instructions. "Get up," he announced with newfound authority and confidence. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." What followed was perhaps the most unusual battle plan in military history. Instead of swords and spears, Gideon distributed trumpets, empty clay jars, and torches to each of his 300 men. The weapons of conventional warfare were set aside in favour of items that seemed more suited to a religious ceremony than a military campaign. Gideon divided his small force into 3 companies of 100 men each. The strategy was simple, yet audacious. They would surround the enemy camp and, at Gideon's signal, create as much noise and confusion as possible while giving the appearance of a much larger force. "Watch me," Gideon instructed his men. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" The plan required perfect timing and coordination. Each man would conceal his torch inside a clay jar, maintaining complete darkness and silence until the moment of attack. Then at Gideon's signal, they would simultaneously break their jars, revealing blazing torches, blow their trumpets with all their might, and shout their battle cry. The psychological impact was designed to be devastating. The enemy would suddenly find themselves surrounded by lights and noise, creating the impression of a massive attacking force. In the confusion of a night assault, with limited visibility and the disorientation of being awakened from sleep, even experienced soldiers could panic and lose their sense of direction. As the three companies moved into position around the vast perimeter of the enemy camp, each man must have felt the weight of the moment. They were not professional soldiers, but ordinary citizens who had answered the call to fight for their freedom. Now they found themselves in the most critical moment of their lives, armed with the most unconventional weapons imaginable, trusting in a God who had promised victory through seemingly impossible means. The middle watch around midnight was traditionally the time when sentries were changed, and vigilance was often at its lowest point. It was at this precise moment that Gideon and his 100 men reached their assigned position on the edge of the camp. Across the valley, 200 other men waited in similar positions, every eye fixed on their leader for the signal that would begin the battle. Gideon raised his torch-filled jar high above his head, then brought it down sharply, smashing it against a rock. The clay shattered with a sound that seemed to echo across the silent valley, and immediately his torch blazed forth in the darkness. At the same instant, he lifted his trumpet to his lips and blew a long, piercing blast. "For the Lord and for Gideon!" he shouted at the top of his lungs. The signal rippled around the camp as 300 jars smashed simultaneously. 300 torches burst into flame, and 300 trumpet heights sounded their defiant call. The battle cry of "For the Lord and for Gideon" echoed from every direction, creating the impression that the Midianite camp was completely surrounded by a massive army. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Thousands of sleeping soldiers were jolted awake to find their camp surrounded by blazing lights and deafening noise. In the confusion and darkness, panic spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers stumbled from their tents, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, unable to determine the size or direction of the attacking force. In their panic and confusion, the Midianites and their allies began attacking each other. Unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, and hearing battle cries in their own languages from every direction, they assumed they had been betrayed by their allies. The coalition that had seemed so formidable began to tear itself apart. The 300 Israelites maintained their positions around the perimeter, continuing to blow their trumpets and hold their torches high, creating the illusion of a massive army that had the enemy completely surrounded. They watched in amazement as God fulfilled his promise in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The panic spread throughout the entire camp like a plague. What had begun as confusion quickly escalated into a full-scale rout as the enemy forces fled in every direction, abandoning their weapons, supplies, and even their camels in their desperate attempt to escape what they perceived as certain destruction. The victory was complete and overwhelming, achieved not through superior numbers or military might, but through divine intervention, working through the obedience of 300 faithful men. The God who had called Gideon from his hiding place in the winepress had once again demonstrated that his power is made perfect in human weakness. As dawn broke over the valley, an astonishing sight greeted the 300 Israelites. Where the night before had stood the mighty encampment of Israel's oppressors, now lay only scattered debris and abandoned supplies. Tents stood empty, their guy ropes cut by fleeing soldiers. Weapons lay discarded where they had fallen from panicked hands. The camels that had been described as innumerable as locusts wandered aimlessly, their owners having fled into the wilderness. The ground itself told the story of the night's chaos. Bloodstains marked the spots where confused allies had struck down one another in the darkness. Personal belongings were strewn across the landscape as the fleeing army had abandoned everything that might slow their escape. The scene looked less like the aftermath of a battle and more like the remnants of a catastrophic natural disaster. Gideon and his men moved through the abandoned camp in wonder, scarcely believing what their eyes were witnessing. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed almost too good to be true. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The army that had terrorized Israel for 7 years had been routed by 300 men armed with trumpets and torches. But God's deliverance was not yet complete. Even as the 300 marvelled at what had occurred in the valley, word of the miraculous victory was spreading throughout the hill country of Israel. Men who had dismissed Gideon's call to arms, who had remained hidden in their caves and strongholds, now emerged with renewed courage and determination. The tribes of Naphtali, Asher and Manasseh rallied to pursue the fleeing Midianites. What had begun with 300 faithful men now swelled into a national movement of liberation. The psychological impact of the victory was as important as the military result. The myth of Midianite invincibility had been shattered in a single night, and the spirit of resistance that had been dormant for so long now burst forth like a river breaking through a dam. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim with urgent instructions. Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah. This strategic move would cut off the enemy's escape routes and ensure that the victory would be complete. The Ephraimites responded with enthusiasm, capturing the fords of the Jordan and trapping many of the fleeing Midianites. In the pursuit that followed, they captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb, whose names meant raven and wolf. These princes, who had struck terror into Israelite hearts for years, were now defeated and killed at the places that would forever bear their names: the rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeb. The pursuit continued beyond the Jordan as Gideon and his original 300, though exhausted, pressed on to capture the remaining Midianite kings, Zaba and Zalmunna. The victory was total and decisive. An empire that had dominated the region for 7 years was completely destroyed in a matter of days. The land of Israel enjoyed peace for 40 years during Gideon's lifetime. The oppression that had driven families into hiding was replaced by prosperity and security. Fields that had been abandoned were cultivated again. Markets that had stood empty bustled with commerce. Children who had grown up knowing only fear could now play freely in their villages. But perhaps the greatest victory was not military but spiritual. Israel had rediscovered that their God was still the same mighty deliverer who had brought their ancestors out of Egypt. The impossible victory served as a permanent reminder that with God all things are possible. The story of Gideon and the 300 speaks across the centuries, with timeless truths that challenge and encourage us today. First, we see that God uses the unlikely. Gideon was not a seasoned warrior or a natural leader. He was a fearful farmer, hiding from his enemies. Yet God saw potential that others missed. This reminds us that God's calling is not based on our qualifications, but on his purposes. Second, the reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300 demonstrates that faith matters more than numbers. In a world obsessed with statistics and metrics, God's economy operates differently. He delights in using small faithful remnants to accomplish great things, ensuring that his power, not human strength, receives the glory. Third, Gideon's requests for signs teach us about the balance between faith and doubt. God was patient with Gideon's need for confirmation, showing us that honest questions and requests for reassurance are not signs of weak faith but of a heart that desires to walk in God's will. Finally, the story shows us that obedience in the face of fear is the essence of courage. Gideon was afraid, his army was outnumbered, and the strategy seemed foolish. Yet they obeyed, and God honoured their faithfulness with victory. When we feel unqualified for the tasks before us, when the odds seem insurmountable, when we need reassurance before taking steps of faith, the story of Gideon reminds us that our God specialises in impossible victories. He is still calling ordinary people to extraordinary purposes, still using the weak to confound the mighty, still turning fearful hearts into faithful warriors. The God who met Gideon at the winepress is the same God who meets us in our hiding places today, calling us to step out in faith and watch him work miracles through surrendered lives. Just as the 300 trumpets and torches became instruments of divine victory, our simple obedience can become the means through which God accomplishes his purposes in our generation. May we have the courage to answer when he calls, the faith to trust when he leads, and the persistence to follow when he sends us into battles that seem impossible to win. For with God, the 300 can defeat the multitudes, and faith can move mountains that seem immovable. The story of Gideon reminds us that our greatest victories come not when we feel strong and capable, but when we acknowledge our weakness and depend completely on God's strength. In those moments of surrender, we discover that we serve a God who delights in doing the impossible through the most unlikely people. And so the story ends where it began, with an invitation to faith, a call to courage, and a promise that the God who delivered Israel through Gideon and the 300 is still delivering his people today. One impossible. Picture this: a young widow standing at a crossroads, dust swirling around her feet as she faces the most important decision of her life. Behind her lies everything familiar: her homeland, her people, her gods. Ahead stretches an uncertain path toward a foreign land with a grieving mother-in-law who has nothing left to offer but heartache. Most would choose the safety of the familiar. But Ruth, she chose love over security, loyalty over convenience, and in that single moment of breathtaking faithfulness, she stepped into a story that would echo through eternity. What if I told you that in the midst of hardship, one small act of kindness could change the course of history? The book of Ruth isn't just another ancient tale gathering dust on library shelves. It's a masterpiece of hope, painted against the darkest canvas of human loss. This isn't a story of mighty warriors or thundering prophets. There are no plagues here, no walls crumbling at the sound of trumpets. Instead, we find something far more profound: the quiet power of unwavering devotion and the gentle hand of divine providence working through ordinary people making extraordinary choices. In a world that often celebrates the loud and flashy, Ruth's story whispers a different truth. It tells us that loyalty can triumph over loss, that kindness can overcome cruelty, and that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't found in earthquake or fire, but in the still, small voice of love, choosing to stay when everything else falls apart. This is a tale of hope, peace, and God's gentle provision. A story that begins with death and ends with life, starts with emptiness and concludes with abundance, opens with despair and closes with joy so profound it reverberates through generations. The beauty of Ruth's narrative lies not in its complexity, but in its simplicity. It's a story anyone can understand because it touches the universal human experiences of loss, love, loyalty, and redemption. Yet beneath this surface simplicity runs a current so deep it connects the heart of ancient Moab to the throne of David, and ultimately to a manger in Bethlehem, where another story of divine love would unfold centuries later. The story begins not with triumph, but with tragedy. Not in the promised land, but in foreign territory. Naomi, whose name ironically means pleasant, finds herself in the bitter reality of compound grief that would break most spirits entirely. She had left Bethlehem during a famine with her husband Elimelech and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, seeking survival in Moab, a land that was both geographically close to Israel and spiritually distant from its God. What started as a temporary sojourn became permanent residence when Elimelech died, leaving Naomi a widow in a foreign land. In ancient times, widowhood wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was an economic and social death sentence. Women had little legal standing, no inheritance rights, and depended entirely on male relatives for protection and provision. Yet Naomi found a glimmer of hope when her sons married Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth. These marriages, while controversial by Israelite standards, brought companionship and the promise of grandchildren who would carry on the family name. But hope proved fleeting. After about 10 years in Moab, both sons died, leaving 3 widows to face an uncertain future together. The Hebrew text doesn't elaborate on how they died. Perhaps disease, perhaps accident, perhaps the simple harsh realities of ancient life. What matters isn't the how, but the devastation that followed. Naomi found herself stripped of everything that defined her identity: wife, mother, provider, protector. She was a living emblem of loss, carrying nothing but grief and 2 foreign daughters-in-law who had their own mourning to bear. When news reached Moab that the famine in Bethlehem had ended, Naomi made a decision, born of both hope and desperation. She would return to her homeland, to her people, to whatever remained of her former life. It was a journey of approximately 50 miles, but it might as well have been to the moon for all the security it promised. She was returning not as the confident woman who had left with her family, but as a broken widow with empty hands and an empty womb, carrying nothing but memories of better days. The moment of truth came when it was time to say goodbye. Standing at the border between Moab and Israel, Naomi turned to her daughters-in-law with words that revealed both her love for them and her own despair. "Go back," she urged them, "each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to your dead and to me." It was a release tinged with blessing, an act of selfless love that put their welfare above her own companionship. Orpah, after much weeping and embracing, made the practical choice. She kissed Naomi goodbye and returned to her people and her gods. History doesn't judge her for this decision. It was sensible, even wise by worldly standards. She was young enough to remarry, to find security and happiness in familiar surroundings. Her choice was understandable, logical, and completely reasonable. But Ruth made a choice that defied every rational calculation. When Naomi urged her to follow Orpah's example, Ruth responded with words that have echoed through millennia, words that capture the very essence of covenant love. "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." This wasn't a momentary burst of emotion. It was a deliberate, irrevocable commitment. Ruth wasn't just choosing to accompany Naomi. She was choosing to abandon everything familiar for everything unknown. She was trading the security of her homeland for the uncertainty of being a foreign widow in Israel. She was exchanging the comfort of her people's acceptance for the likelihood of being viewed as an outsider, even an enemy, given the historical tensions between Moab and Israel. Most remarkably, Ruth was choosing Naomi's God over her own family deities. In the ancient world, this wasn't merely a personal preference, it was a complete transformation of identity, worldview, and destiny. She was stepping away from the gods she had known since childhood and embracing the God of Israel, whom she knew primarily through the testimony of her mother-in-law's life and loss. The journey to Bethlehem began with two broken women walking together toward an uncertain future, but it was really the beginning of one of history's most beautiful stories of redemption. Ruth's choice to stay wasn't just loyalty to Naomi, it was an unconscious choice to step into the stream of God's redemptive plan for humanity. Without knowing it, she was walking not just toward Bethlehem, but toward her destiny as an ancestor of kings and ultimately of the King of Kings. The arrival in Bethlehem was far from triumphant. When Naomi and Ruth entered the town, the women who had known Naomi before could hardly believe their eyes. "Can this be Naomi?" they asked, seeing the toll that loss and hardship had taken on their former neighbour. Naomi's response revealed the depth of her pain. "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty." It was barley harvest time, a detail that might seem incidental, but carries profound significance. In God's economy, timing is never accidental. They arrived not during the lean months when work was scarce and food scarcer, but during the season of harvest when there might be opportunities for survival. Still, being widowed foreigners in a patriarchal society meant they stood at the very bottom of the social ladder, dependent on the kindness of others and whatever work Ruth could find. Ruth, whose name likely means friendship or companion, immediately proved the accuracy of her name through her actions. Without waiting for Naomi to devise a plan or wallowing in self-pity over their circumstances, she took initiative with the words that reveal her character. "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favour." This simple statement masks the courage it required. Ruth was volunteering to do backbreaking labour in the scorching sun, to work alongside the lowest members of society, to face possible harassment or rejection, all to provide for the woman she had chosen to love. Gleaning was God's provision for the poor, embedded in the law of Moses as a safety net for society's most vulnerable. Landowners were commanded not to harvest to the very edges of their fields and not to go back for grain that was dropped or missed. This leftover grain could be gathered by widows, orphans and foreigners, the three groups most at risk in ancient society. It was honest work, but humble work, requiring long hours bent over in the heat, gathering grain stalk by stalk, hoping for enough to make a small meal. The providential nature of Ruth's story becomes apparent in the simple phrase, "as it turned out." She happened to find herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, a prominent man from Elimelech's clan. But in God's story, there are no coincidences, only the invisible hand of providence, orchestrating circumstances for purposes beyond human understanding. Boaz first noticed Ruth through his foreman's report. When he asked about the young woman working diligently in his field, he learned her identity. She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. That description carried weight. Moabites were not generally welcomed in Israelite society. They were descendants of Lot through an incestuous relationship, and their nation had historically been hostile to Israel. For Ruth to be identified first by her nationality rather than her name suggests the social barriers she faced. Yet when Boaz observed Ruth personally, he saw beyond her foreign origins to her character. He watched her work with steady dedication, saw her respectful interaction with his workers, and most importantly, he had heard of her kindness to Naomi. In a society that valued family loyalty, above almost all other virtues, Ruth's devotion to her mother-in-law had become legendary. Word had spread throughout Bethlehem of the young Moabite woman who had abandoned everything to care for her husband's mother. Boaz's first words to Ruth were revolutionary for their kindness. "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me." He was offering her protection, stability, and dignity. In ancient times, young women working in fields were vulnerable to harassment and worse. By placing her under his personal protection and encouraging her to work alongside his regular female employees rather than as a desperate outsider, Boaz was treating Ruth not as a foreign charity case, but as a valued person worthy of respect. But his kindness went further. He instructed his workers to let her drink from their water jars when she was thirsty, in a time and place where clean water was precious. He told her to eat with his harvesting crew, sharing in the roasted grain and vinegar that sustained the workers. Most remarkably, he quietly instructed his harvesters to pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. Ruth's response to this unexpected kindness reveals both her humility and her wisdom. She fell prostrate before Boaz, asking, "Why have I found such favour in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Her question acknowledges her outsider status while expressing genuine gratitude for treatment she neither expected nor felt she deserved. Boaz's answer illuminates the reputation Ruth had already built in Bethlehem. "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." These words are more than polite conversation. They're a blessing that recognizes Ruth's choice to trust in Israel's God. The image of taking refuge under God's wings evokes the protective presence of the Almighty, like a bird sheltering its young. Boaz was acknowledging that Ruth's kindness to Naomi was really an act of faith, a stepping into the covenant community of Israel despite her foreign birth. That day Ruth gathered approximately an ephah of barley, about half a bushel, far more than a typical gleaner could hope to gather. When she returned home and showed Naomi her extraordinary harvest, along with the leftover food from the workers' meal, Naomi immediately recognized God's hand in these events. Her response, "Blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead," reveals her growing awareness that their apparent coincidental encounter with Boaz was actually divine appointment. When Naomi learned that the field owner was Boaz, her excitement was palpable. "The man is our close relative," she explained to Ruth. "He is one of our kinsman redeemers." This wasn't just good news, it was the first glimpse of hope Naomi had felt since leaving Moab. The kinsman redeemer system was God's provision for protecting family lines and property. A close male relative had both the right and responsibility to buy back family land that had been sold due to poverty and to marry a widowed relative to preserve the family name and inheritance. Ruth continued working in Boaz's fields through both the barley and wheat harvests, likely a period of several months. Day after day, she laboured faithfully, building a reputation for diligence and integrity while gradually becoming part of the community. She was no longer just the Moabite woman, but Ruth, the devoted daughter-in-law whose character spoke louder than her foreign birth. During this time, a subtle transformation was taking place. Ruth was learning the ways of Israel, observing their customs, participating in their community life. She was also, unknowingly, becoming the object of Boaz's growing admiration and affection. Though significantly older than Ruth, Boaz found himself drawn not to her physical beauty, but to the beauty of her character, her loyalty, her faith, and her gentle strength. This season in the fields was more than economic survival. It was Ruth's integration into the covenant community of Israel and the beginning of a love story that would have implications far beyond the borders of Bethlehem. As the harvest season continued, the relationship between Ruth and Boaz deepened through daily interactions marked by mutual respect and growing affection. Boaz's kindness wasn't mere politeness. It was the recognition of extraordinary character in someone society might easily overlook. Every morning when Ruth arrived in his fields, every conversation they shared, every protective gesture he made was weaving a tapestry of love, built on a foundation of honour and integrity. Naomi, meanwhile, was experiencing her own transformation. The bitterness that had defined her return to Bethlehem was gradually giving way to something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Watching Ruth's faithful service and witnessing Boaz's unprecedented kindness toward her daughter-in-law, Naomi began to see the hand of God moving in their circumstances. The woman who had declared herself empty was beginning to see the possibility of fullness once again. It was Naomi who first recognized what Ruth, in her humility and focus on daily survival, might have missed. Boaz's interest was more than benevolent concern for a hard-working gleaner. His protection of Ruth, his generous provisions, his public praise of her character, all pointed to something deeper. In a culture where marriages were often arranged for economic and social advantage, here was a man of standing choosing to honour a foreign widow, not for what she could bring him, but for who she was. The harvest season was also a time of community celebration. The successful gathering of crops meant survival for another year, and the people of Bethlehem marked these occasions with festivals and gatherings. During these celebrations, Ruth would have had opportunities to observe Israelite customs, to learn their songs and stories, to better understand the God she had chosen to follow. She was becoming not just a resident of Bethlehem, but a true daughter of Israel. Boaz's generosity during this time went far beyond legal requirements or social expectations. The law required landowners to allow gleaning, but it didn't require them to ensure the gleaners found substantial amounts. When Boaz instructed his workers to intentionally drop extra grain for Ruth, he was going above and beyond duty into the realm of love. When he invited her to share meals with his workers, he was treating her as family rather than charity case. The other workers in the field would have noticed this special treatment. In small communities, nothing goes unobserved, and Boaz's obvious favour toward Ruth would have been the subject of much discussion. Yet the narrative suggests this talk was positive rather than scandalous. Ruth's reputation for integrity and Boaz's character as a righteous man meant their growing relationship was viewed with approval rather than suspicion. During these months, Ruth was also learning about the God of Israel through observation and experience. She saw how the law protected the vulnerable, how the community cared for its members, how even foreigners could find acceptance when they showed faithfulness. The God she had committed to following in her pledge to Naomi was revealing himself to be trustworthy through the kindness of his people. The emotional climate was changing for all three main characters. Ruth, while still focused on providing for Naomi, was discovering that life could hold possibilities beyond mere survival. Naomi was moving from despair to cautious optimism as she watched events unfold. And Boaz, a man who might have remained unmarried and childless, was finding his heart stirred by a woman whose character exemplified everything he valued. The religious significance of this season cannot be understated. Ruth was effectively completing her conversion to Judaism, not through formal ceremony, but through lived experience. She was learning to trust in the God of Israel, not through theological instruction, but through witnessing his provision and protection. Her faith was being refined and deepened through the daily rhythm of work, community, and growing relationship with both Naomi and Boaz. The harvest season was also a time when family relationships and inheritance rights became particularly relevant. With successful crops came discussions of land ownership, family obligations, and the duties of kinsman redeemers. Naomi would have been acutely aware of these conversations, knowing that her late husband's property rights and family obligations remained unresolved. The presence of a kinsman redeemer like Boaz, combined with his obvious interest in Ruth, would have sparked hope for resolution of their precarious situation. As the wheat harvest drew to a close, the foundations had been laid for the dramatic events that would follow. Ruth had proven her character through months of faithful work. Boaz had demonstrated his integrity and growing love through consistent kindness. Naomi had moved from bitter resignation to hopeful planning. The community had accepted Ruth as one of their own, and God's providence had been orchestrating circumstances toward a conclusion that would provide redemption, love, and legacy for generations to come. The harvest season was ending, and with it came both celebration and anxiety about the future. Naomi, who had been quietly observing the growing relationship between Ruth and Boaz, decided it was time to take decisive action. Her plan, which she shared with Ruth, was both bold and risky. Ruth would approach Boaz at the threshing floor during the harvest festival and essentially propose marriage by invoking his rights and responsibilities as a kinsman redeemer. "My daughter," Naomi said to Ruth, "I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for." This wasn't merely matchmaking, it was strategic thinking about survival and security. Naomi understood that while Boaz's kindness during harvest season had been extraordinary, the relationship needed to move beyond casual benevolence to formal commitment if it were to provide lasting security for both women. The plan required enormous courage from Ruth. She would need to bathe, perfume herself, put on her best clothes, and go to the threshing floor where Boaz would be winnowing barley. After he had eaten and drunk and was sleeping beside the grain pile, she was to uncover his feet and lie down. When he woke and asked what she wanted, she was to say, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you're a kinsman redeemer." This might sound forward by modern standards, but it was actually a proper, though bold, way for a woman to request marriage from a kinsman redeemer. The act of lying at his feet was a gesture of submission and trust. The request to spread his garment over her was asking him to take her under his protection as his wife. The same imagery Boaz had used earlier when he spoke of Ruth taking refuge under God's wings. Ruth's response to this plan reveals the depth of her trust in Naomi. "I will do whatever you say." She didn't question the wisdom of the approach or worry about the potential for misunderstanding or rejection. She had committed herself to following Naomi's guidance, and she would do so even in this most vulnerable moment. The night at the threshing floor was a pivotal moment in the story. Ruth followed Naomi's instructions precisely, approaching quietly and lying at Boaz's feet after he had fallen asleep. Around midnight, Boaz stirred and discovered someone at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked in the darkness. Ruth's answer was direct and humble. "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you're a kinsman redeemer." She was formally requesting that he fulfill his family obligations by marrying her, thereby providing security for both her and Naomi, and potentially redeeming Elimelech's family property. Boaz's response exceeded Ruth's hopes. "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he said. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." He was acknowledging that Ruth's approach to him wasn't born of desperation or opportunism, but of faithfulness to family obligations and trust in God's provision. However, Boaz revealed a complication Ruth hadn't known about. There was another kinsman redeemer who had a closer family relationship and therefore first rights to redeem Elimelech's property and marry Ruth. "Although it is true that I am near of kin," Boaz explained, "there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I." This was devastating news, but Boaz assured Ruth that the matter would be resolved properly, according to law and custom. Boaz's handling of this delicate situation reveals his character perfectly. He could have taken advantage of Ruth's vulnerable position, but instead he protected her reputation and committed himself to resolving the legal complications honourably. He told Ruth to stay until morning, but leave before anyone could recognise her, protecting her from potential scandal. Before she left, he filled her cloak with 6 measures of barley, ensuring she didn't return to Naomi empty-handed. When Ruth returned home and reported everything to Naomi, the older woman's response was confident. "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today." Naomi knew Boaz well enough to trust that he would handle the situation with integrity and dispatch. That very morning, Boaz went to the city gate, the place where legal and business matters were conducted in ancient Israel. He sat down and waited for the other kinsman redeemer to pass by. When the man appeared, Boaz called him over and assembled a group of 10 elders as witnesses for the legal proceedings that would follow. The negotiation was masterful. Boaz began by telling the man about a piece of land that had belonged to their relative Elimelech, which Naomi was selling. According to law, the nearest kinsman redeemer had first rights to purchase the property to keep it in the family. The man was interested until Boaz explained the complete package. "On the day you buy the land from Naomi," Boaz said, "you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." This changed everything. Purchasing the land was one thing, but marrying Ruth meant taking responsibility for supporting her and Naomi, and any sons born to Ruth would inherit the redeemed property rather than being part of the Redeemer's own family line. The closer kinsman declined. "Then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." His refusal, while disappointing for him personally, was providential for Ruth and Boaz. To formalise the transaction, the man took off his sandal and gave it to Boaz, the customary way of transferring rights in Israel. Boaz then made a public declaration before the assembled witnesses. "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown." The witnesses responded with a beautiful blessing. "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. Through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." This blessing was prophetic in ways the speakers couldn't imagine. They were comparing Ruth to the matriarchs of Israel and expressing hope for the continuation of significant family lines. Their mention of Perez was particularly significant, as Perez was an ancestor of Boaz and would be an ancestor of David and ultimately Jesus. The marriage between Ruth and Boaz was celebrated throughout Bethlehem. Here was a love story that had captured the community's imagination. The virtuous foreign woman and the honourable landowner, brought together by providence and confirmed by their own choices of faithfulness and integrity. Their wedding was not just a personal celebration, but a community affirmation of God's goodness and the power of loyal love. Ruth, who had come to Bethlehem as a destitute foreign widow, was now the wife of one of the town's most respected men. Naomi, who had returned empty, was now provided for and honoured as the mother-in-law of a prominent family. Boaz, who might have remained childless, was married to a woman whose character and beauty had won his heart. The redemption was complete, financially, socially, emotionally and spiritually. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz represented more than the happy ending to a beautiful love story. It was the beginning of a legacy that would reshape history. Their union produced a son named Obed, whose birth brought completion to the themes of redemption and restoration that had woven throughout the narrative. When the women of Bethlehem saw Naomi holding her grandson, they declared, "Naomi has a son," acknowledging that through Ruth's faithfulness, Naomi's line would continue. The birth of Obed was celebrated as divine vindication of Ruth's loyalty and God's faithfulness to his people. The same women who had witnessed Naomi's bitter return to Bethlehem now rejoiced with her in this ultimate reversal of fortune. "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer," they told Naomi. "May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who's better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." The significance of being better than 7 sons cannot be overstated in a culture that prized male heirs above all other blessings. 7 was the number of completeness and perfection. So to say Ruth was better than 7 sons was to declare her the ultimate blessing, a foreign woman who had proven more valuable than the greatest treasure a family could hope for. But the story of Ruth and Boaz was part of a much larger narrative that wouldn't be fully revealed for generations. Their son Obed became the father of Jesse, who became the father of David, the shepherd boy who would become Israel's greatest king. Through their lineage, Ruth, the Moabite widow, became the great-grandmother of the man after God's own heart, whose dynasty would rule Israel and whose throne God promised would endure forever. The genealogy that concludes the book of Ruth traces the line from Perez, son of Judah and Tamar, through Boaz and Ruth to David, showing how Ruth's faithfulness became part of the messianic line. What began as a simple act of loyalty to a grieving mother-in-law ultimately contributed to God's plan for redeeming all humanity. Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi and adopt Israel's God placed her squarely in the centre of salvation history. This foreign woman, who could have been excluded from the covenant community, instead became one of only 4 women mentioned in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, along with Tamar, Rahab and Bathsheba. Each of these women had unusual circumstances that made their inclusion remarkable, but Ruth's story is particularly beautiful because it demonstrates how God's love extends beyond ethnic and national boundaries to embrace all who respond to him in faith. The legacy of Ruth extends beyond genealogy to the realm of character and faith. Her story became a teaching tool for generations of Israelites about the power of loyal love, the Hebrew concept of hesed that encompasses devotion, faithfulness, and sacrificial commitment. Ruth embodied hesed in her relationship with Naomi, and Boaz demonstrated it in his treatment of Ruth. Their marriage was built on this foundation of covenant love that mirrors God's relationship with his people. Ruth's integration into Israelite society also established an important precedent for how foreigners could be welcomed into the covenant community. Her acceptance wasn't based on her ethnicity or social status, but on her character and faith. She proved that nationality was less important than loyalty, that birth circumstances mattered less than personal choices, and that God's family was open to all who chose to belong to it. The story of Ruth also demonstrates God's providence in the seemingly ordinary events of life. There were no dramatic miracles in Ruth's story, no parting of seas or walls falling down, yet God's hand guided every step. The timing of their arrival during harvest season, the chance encounter with Boaz's field, the availability of the kinsman redeemer laws, the other redeemer's decision to decline his rights, all of these coincidences work together to create the perfect conditions for redemption and blessing. For Naomi, Ruth's legacy meant the restoration of everything she thought she had lost forever. Through Ruth's son, Naomi's family line continued, her security was assured, and her later years were filled with joy instead of bitterness. The woman who had asked to be called Mara, bitter, was now surrounded by the sweetness of new life and hope. For Boaz, marrying Ruth brought fulfillment he might never have expected. Instead of remaining childless, he became the father of a son who would carry on his name and values. His kindness to a foreign gleaner was rewarded with a love that enriched his life and extended his influence through generations. For Bethlehem and the wider community, Ruth's story became a testament to the power of character over circumstances. Her reputation for faithfulness outlasted her foreign origins, and her descendants would bring honour to the very town where she had once worked humbly in the fields. The house of bread, Bethlehem's meaning, became truly blessed through the presence of this woman who had chosen loyalty over security. The themes of Ruth's story, loyalty rewarded, faithfulness blessed, love conquering prejudice, and providence working through ordinary events, would resonate throughout scripture and human experience. Her example of sacrificial love prefigures the ultimate sacrifice that would come through her descendant, Jesus, who would demonstrate the same kind of loyal love on a cosmic scale. Ruth's legacy teaches us that small acts of faithfulness can have eternal consequences, that God's plans often work through unlikely people in unexpected ways, and that the greatest blessings sometimes come disguised as difficult choices. Her decision to stay with Naomi seemed like the harder path, but it led to blessings she could never have imagined. As we close the pages of Ruth's story, we're left not with the thunderous echoes of conquest or the dramatic flourishes of miracle, but with something far more profound, the quiet certainty that love endures, that faithfulness matters, and that God's gentle hand guides even the most ordinary moments toward extraordinary purposes. Ruth's tale doesn't shout at us, it whispers truths that settle into our hearts, like seeds waiting for the right season to bloom. The beauty of Ruth's narrative lies in its accessibility. We may never face exile in a foreign land or need to glean in harvest fields, but we all encounter crossroads where we must choose between security and loyalty, between what's easy and what's right. Ruth's story reminds us that these moments, when we choose love over convenience, faithfulness over comfort, are the building blocks of legacy. In our contemporary world, where relationships are often disposable and commitment is seen as restriction rather than strength, Ruth's devotion to Naomi offers a counter-narrative. Her famous words, "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay," weren't just poetry. They were a life philosophy that valued connection over independence, loyalty over self-preservation. In an age of radical individualism, Ruth models radical commitment. Her story also speaks to anyone who has ever felt like an outsider. Ruth was foreign by birth, widowed by circumstance, and poor by necessity. 3 strikes that should have kept her on society's margins. Yet through character and faith, she moved from the periphery to the centre of God's plan. Her journey from Moabite stranger to beloved ancestor of kings offers hope to everyone who has wondered if their background, circumstances, or mistakes disqualify them from significance. The gentleness of God's providence in Ruth's story offers comfort to those who wonder if their lives matter in the grand scheme of things. There were no burning bushes or angelic visitations in Ruth's experience, just the quiet orchestration of ordinary events toward extraordinary outcomes. Her story suggests that God is just as present in the mundane moments as in the miraculous ones, working through harvest seasons and chance encounters to weave tapestries of grace. For those experiencing seasons of loss like Naomi, Ruth's story offers hope without minimizing pain. Naomi's bitterness was real and justified. She had lost everything that mattered to her. Yet through Ruth's faithfulness and God's providence, her empty hands were filled again. The story doesn't suggest that loss isn't real, or that pain isn't valid, but it does promise that emptiness isn't the end of the story. Boaz represents the power of kindness and integrity in a world that often seems harsh and selfish. His treatment of Ruth demonstrates how one person's compassion can transform another's entire trajectory. He saw beyond her circumstances to her character, beyond her foreignness to her faithfulness. In doing so, he models how we might approach the marginalised and struggling people in our own communities. The redemption theme that runs throughout Ruth's story speaks to our deepest longing for second chances and new beginnings. Ruth redeemed Naomi's emptiness through loyalty. Boaz redeemed Ruth's vulnerability through love. Their union redeemed a family line that seemed destined for extinction. This pattern of redemption points toward the ultimate Redeemer who would come through their lineage, offering restoration to all who are broken, lost, or forgotten. Perhaps most powerfully, Ruth's story reminds us that our choices ripple through eternity in ways we cannot foresee. When Ruth chose to stay with Naomi, she had no idea she was choosing to become the great-grandmother of King David or an ancestor of Jesus. She simply chose love. Her decision, made in a moment of grief and uncertainty, affected the course of history and the salvation of the world. The story teaches us that faithfulness is its own reward, but it's also the foundation for blessings we cannot imagine. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi brought her love with Boaz. Her willingness to work humbly brought her honour. Her choice to embrace Israel's God brought her into the centre of his redemptive plan. As we reflect on Ruth's journey from foreign widow to beloved ancestor, we're reminded that God delights in using the unlikely and the overlooked. He chooses the humble to confound the mighty, the faithful to accomplish the impossible, the loving to heal the broken. Ruth's story is ultimately not about her exceptional character, though that was remarkable, but about God's exceptional grace working through ordinary obedience. In a world that often feels chaotic and uncertain, Ruth's story offers the gentle assurance that someone is writing a larger story, weaving together our small acts of faithfulness into a tapestry of purpose and beauty. Every choice to love instead of abandon, to stay instead of leave, to serve instead of demand, becomes part of a narrative larger than ourselves. The final truth Ruth's story whispers to our hearts is perhaps the most beautiful of all. Sometimes the smallest acts of love carry the weight of eternity. A foreign woman's decision to care for her grieving mother-in-law became part of the story that leads to Christmas morning and the cross of Calvary. Her simple faithfulness participated in God's plan to redeem not just a family, but a world. Ruth's legacy lives on not only in the genealogies of Scripture, but in every act of sacrificial love, every choice of loyalty over convenience, every decision to stay when leaving would be easier. Her story continues in our stories when we choose, as she did, to let love be our guide and faithfulness be our strength. In the end, Ruth teaches us that we don't need to be heroes to be heroic. We don't need to be perfect to be used by God. And we don't need to see the whole staircase to take the next step of faith. Sometimes, all that's required is the courage to say, like Ruth, "Where you go, I will go," and trust that the God who guided her steps will guide ours as well. The gentle hope of Ruth's story rests in this beautiful truth. In God's economy, no act of love is ever wasted, no gesture of faithfulness ever forgotten, and no choice to follow him ever in vain. Sometimes the smallest acts of love carry the weight of eternity, echoing through generations and touching the very heart of God's redemptive plan for